It's Friday night, and I'm on my couch, wrapped in a blanket like some kind of burrito, sipping on a hot chocolate that I didn't make myself. No, I had it delivered, just one hot chocolate, extra whipped cream, zero shame. As I'm sipping away, I realized that this wasn't just a treat. It was a whole experience. I had planned my evening around this little ritual, ordered my gourmet drink as if it were a three-course meal, and now here I was sipping it like I'd earned it after a long, exhausting day of sitting on the same couch I'd been on all week. It makes me chuckle. We've somehow reached this level of convenience where something as simple as a hot chocolate becomes a whole orchestrated event. A self-care ritual, if I dare call it that, involving apps, GPS tracking, and delivery fees. I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's something strangely satisfying about knowing I can create these tiny moments for myself without lifting much more than a finger. I think back to my childhood when a Friday night treat was popping a frozen pizza in the oven and feeling like a mini chef. Now, with a few taps, a restaurant-quality hot chocolate lands at my door, and it feels oddly luxurious. This gets me thinking about the new rhythms of daily life, these small luxuries we barely notice, but which somehow shape our routines. Like my morning ritual. I don't even set alarms anymore. My phone does it automatically, adjusting based on my calendar. It's like having a mini personal assistant that knows my schedule better than I do. I'll wake up, groggy-eyed, shuffle to the kitchen, and the coffee maker's already brewed my coffee because it's connected to a timer on my phone. By the time I'm awake enough to even notice my surroundings, my coffee's right there, steaming, as if it had anticipated my every need. And the strangest thing? This is all so normal now. It doesn't even feel luxurious. It just feels expected. Like, I would actually be a little offended if my coffee wasn't ready on time, or if my alarm didn't automatically account for a late meeting the night before. These small conveniences, somehow they've raised my standards for what counts as ordinary. I laugh thinking about it. My grandparents used to marvel at microwaves, and here I am, mildly annoyed if I have to tap more than once to place my coffee order. Or how about grocery shopping? My app knows when I'm running low on essentials. It'll ping me with a reminder, and like clockwork, I'll just reorder everything in the exact quantities I need. I can't remember the last time I actually walked through a grocery store with a cart, browsing shelves, checking prices. My digital cart knows me better than I know myself. If I suddenly run out of toothpaste or notice the milk's running low, I just swipe and it's restocked within hours. There's something almost eerie about it. This algorithm that has memorized my pantry and probably knows I prefer almond milk to oat milk before I even admit it to myself. Then, of course, there's how I stay connected. You'd think, with all this convenience and automation, I'd be lonely, right? Nope. If anything, my days are filled with these mini check-ins, snippets of friends' lives streaming by on my phone. One friend's cat has a new costume, another's kid is learning to walk, and somehow, I'm involved. I can comment, like, even send hugs with a single emoji. It's this strange dance of interaction that doesn't require much effort, but somehow keeps everyone in the loop. I feel like I know what's happening in my friends' lives almost in real time, yet I couldn't tell you the last time I actually had a full-length conversation with any of them. It's as if we've all silently agreed that scrolling through each other's photos and firing off the occasional thumbs up counts as quality time now. And birthdays. Oh man, birthdays have changed. I'll get a dozen notifications on someone's big day, reminding me not just to say happy birthday, but suggesting specific ways to celebrate. Send a digital card, post a fun memory, add a GIF. If I'm close to the person, maybe I'll send a message with a few emojis. If it's an acquaintance, a simple HBD on their wall feels like a job well done. We've streamlined birthdays down to seconds. I used to write cards by hand, call people, actually see them on their special day. Now half my friends are scattered around the world, and a little digital shout-out feels sufficient. It's like we're all in this tacit agreement. Life's busy, and a quick click will do. I'll think, happy birthday, hope it's great, and then get back to whatever I was doing. Speaking of time, even my work life has been streamlined to a level I would have never believed possible. My emails are sorted by priority, later, and someday. My meetings are suggested for me based on mutual availability. My tasks are color-coded by deadlines, and I can hardly remember the last time I had to organize anything myself. I practically live in an ecosystem of reminders and notifications. It's convenient, sure, but sometimes I catch myself thinking, when did I become so passive in my own life? My calendar feels like it's managing me more than the other way around. And yet, for all of its convenience, there's a strange sort of peace in this way of living. I'm moving through life like it's on autopilot, and I kind of like it. Everything's taken care of, from food to social interactions, all tailored to my preferences, neatly scheduled, and often entirely virtual. I know it's kind of funny, maybe a little absurd, but there's something comforting in knowing that my day will unfold with minimal disruption. No surprises, just smooth sailing on the sea of algorithm-driven efficiency. Even entertainment has become a kind of pre-packaged convenience. I'll browse endless titles on streaming platforms, watching trailers, adding things to my list, and half the time, I end up watching a show I've already seen. I could theoretically watch anything, yet somehow the sheer number of options paralyzes me. And the craziest part? I'm okay with that. I'll rewatch an old favorite, fully knowing there's 1,000 other things I could explore. It's like a reminder that with all these choices, sometimes simplicity wins. These little habits have become so baked into my routine that they're like breathing. I know it sounds strange, but I think I'd actually feel a little lost without them. I know there's a price to all of this convenience. Maybe we're all a bit more isolated, a bit less spontaneous. But it's also created this kind of invisible rhythm to my day that, oddly enough, makes me feel connected. Connected to my schedule, my routines, my friends' lives flashing by in stories and posts. So here I am, wrapped in my blanket, sipping the hot chocolate I barely moved to order, marveling at how different life is from a decade ago. It's funny, really, this strange digital ballet we're all part of, all synced up but somehow barely in touch. Yet I wouldn't trade it. There's something so distinctly now about these little conveniences, so perfectly reflective of this modern life we're all living. And it makes me wonder, what's the one convenience in your life that you'd miss the most if it disappeared? Even if it's just as small and silly as ordering hot chocolate at 11 p.m. Last spring, I decided to take my first real vacation in years. I was burned out, ready to escape my everyday routine, and figured a week in Europe would be the perfect reset. But instead of the usual touristy destinations, I booked a flight to a tiny town in the Pyrenees called Valverdit. I'd found it on a travel blog, described as a place where time forgot. It had one hotel, a crumbling castle, and only a couple of hundred residents. I planned to do some hiking, maybe read by the mountains, and return to my life fully refreshed. But what I got was something I couldn't have planned if I tried. When I arrived, the village was even smaller and quieter than I'd imagined, like something straight out of a painting, with narrow cobblestone streets and stone cottages with little clay roofs. I checked into a quaint inn run by an elderly couple who spoke no English. Between my rusty Spanish and a lot of exaggerated hand gestures, I managed to get a room with a view of the mountains and a promise of desayuno, breakfast in the morning. On my first morning, I was woken up by the sound of bells, soft at first, but getting louder until they seemed to fill the entire valley. I looked out the window and saw a line of people walking up the hillside, each carrying small bundles. Curious, I threw on my jacket and headed outside to see what was happening. I asked a young woman near the inn, and she said in a thick accent, "It's for the Festival de la Niebla, or the Festival of Fog." She didn't explain further, just smiled, waved, and gestured for me to follow. I didn't even hesitate. Something about the sight of those people climbing the hill in the morning light, with the mist rising around them, made it impossible not to go along. The climb was steep, but the air was so fresh, scented with pine and wild herbs, that I barely noticed. We reached a clearing where a group of villagers had set up long tables covered with flowers, candles, and plates of some kind of sweetbread. An older man, who looked like he'd been plucked straight from another century, handed me a small clay cup of wine and nodded solemnly. I didn't understand a word of what he said, but I clinked my cup with his anyway. At some point, the entire group went silent, and a woman with a voice that could carry across mountains started singing. I don't know how to describe it except to say it felt like the kind of song you'd hear in a dream. It wasn't in Spanish or French. Later, someone told me it was in Catalan. The song was slow and haunting, like a lullaby and a prayer all wrapped into one. And just as she started singing, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the clearing until it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The whole scene was surreal, like being in some kind of enchanted forest. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the fog lifted. People began moving, lighting candles and setting them on small rocks that dotted the hillside. When I asked what the candles were for, a man about my age with an easy smile said they were meant for Las Almas, the souls of the village's ancestors. He told me that every year, the villagers make the journey up the hill to honor those who lived and died here, lighting candles to help guide their spirits back to the village for a night. We spent the day together up there, eating, drinking, and swapping stories. It was one of those experiences where you can't stop smiling because you can't quite believe where you are and what you're doing. I felt like an outsider, but was welcomed in all the same, as if they'd been waiting for me to show up. As dusk approached, I felt this tap on my shoulder. It was the man I'd met earlier, Mark, and he said, "Now we go to the next part." Intrigued, I followed him down a narrow path leading to a stone house at the edge of the village. Inside, several villagers were gathered around an old woman with a shawl and sharp, knowing eyes. I quickly learned that she was the Karandra, a healer. Mark whispered that she could see things others couldn't, and that people came to her for blessings, advice, or to hear the wisdom of the valley. As night fell, we each took turns sitting with her. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I wasn't quite sure what to say, and half expected her to roll her eyes at the tourist. But she just looked at me with a gaze that was both stern and kind, then took my hands and started murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. She paused, looked at me intensely, and said in halting English, "You are searching, but you do not know what for." I laughed a little because, well, she wasn't wrong. Then she reached into a pouch around her neck and pulled out a small, polished stone, placing it in my hand. She told me it was a Piedra de Claridad, a clarity stone. I didn't really believe it would do anything, but I nodded, thanked her, and tucked it in my pocket. The rest of the night blurred into a strange, beautiful mix of music, laughter, and stories told around bonfires. Mark and I spent hours talking about everything and nothing, watching the stars come out. By then, I'd lost track of time and didn't even care. I felt connected to everything around me in a way that's hard to put into words, like I'd somehow wandered into a chapter of my own story that I didn't know I'd been missing. Eventually, the villagers started drifting back down the hill, and Mark walked me back to the inn. As we stood outside, he handed me a small bundle of wild herbs he'd picked along the path, a traditional gift of the valley, he explained. I laughed and thanked him, not really knowing what else to say. It felt like I was leaving something behind, but I also felt filled up, like I'd found something I hadn't even known I'd lost. When I left Valverdant the next morning, it felt like waking from a dream. I kept expecting to look back and see nothing there, like the whole village had vanished with the fog. For weeks after, I carried that stone in my pocket, and maybe it's just in my head, but things really did start to feel clearer. It was like that tiny town had gifted me some kind of hidden strength, a quiet certainty I'd been missing for a long time. Now, every once in a while, when I feel lost or stuck, I take out that little stone and remember that foggy hillside and the kindness of strangers who made me feel like I belonged. I can't say it changed my life in some big, dramatic way, but it left me with a kind of peace that feels like magic. Has anyone else stumbled into a place that felt like a dream, but left you feeling more grounded than ever? It started in the least likely of places, a shared cab. Rain was coming down in sheets, and I was stuck without an umbrella, glaring at the packed street of taxis, all filled with people who had the foresight to call one before the downpour. Just as I was resigning myself to a soaked walk home, a yellow cab pulled up, and I was about to jump in when I heard a voice behind me. "Mind if I share?" Turning, I saw him, a guy around my age, looking equally drenched, one hand holding up a newspaper over his head in a futile attempt to stay dry. I hesitated for a split second, but he flashed a smile that was warm and a little cheeky, so I shrugged and scooted over, letting him slide into the seat beside me. We exchanged the usual "what a night, huh?" pleasantries as he shook the water from his hair and introduced himself as Liam. I told him my name, and from there, we fell into a surprisingly easy conversation as the cab wound its way through the rain-soaked streets. By the time we reached my stop, We'd been talking for what felt like hours. He was sharp, sarcastic, and had this way of twisting mundane things into stories that made me laugh. On impulse, and not wanting the night to end just yet, I suggested we grab a coffee at the 24-hour diner down the block. To my surprise, he agreed without a moment's hesitation. Inside, we found a booth by the window, watching the rain blur the city lights as we talked. We ordered greasy fries, shared stories about bad dates and embarrassing moments, and I was startled by how comfortable it all felt. He had this relaxed confidence, like he'd known me for years, and it was almost unsettling how natural it was to just be around him. Hours passed unnoticed, and when we finally left, it was nearly dawn. Outside the diner, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening. He looked at me with a mischievous grin and asked if I'd ever seen the sunrise from the bridge. Normally, I would have thought it was a cheesy line, but with Liam, it felt like an invitation to an adventure. So, we walked together in the early morning quiet, crossing the bridge as the first rays of sunlight crept over the city skyline. There was something magical about it. The calm before the world woke up, the silence broken only by our laughter as we leaned against the railing, watching the city come to life. As the sun rose, I felt this strange sense of contentment. I wasn't thinking about what this meant or where it was going. I was just happy to be there, sharing that moment with him. He turned to me and said, "I feel like I've known you forever." And oddly, I felt the same way. It was a line that should have felt cliché, but it didn't. It just felt true. We exchanged numbers before we parted, but I wasn't expecting much. It felt like one of those beautiful, fleeting nights that you remember fondly, a rare connection that exists in a perfect bubble and fades away with the daylight. But Liam surprised me. He texted me that afternoon, just a simple, "Last night was unreal. Want to do it again sometime?" I agreed, maybe a little too eagerly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had started wasn't done yet. Our second date was no less spontaneous than the first. He invited me to an art show, not because he cared much about art, but because he knew I did. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. The night turned into an adventure of its own. We spent half the time making fun of the pretentiousness of the gallery crowd, and the other half discussing the random pieces that actually struck us. Afterward, we walked aimlessly, sharing stories about our lives, our families, and our dreams, each moment a mix of laughter and quiet, unspoken intimacy. Things progressed naturally from there. We didn't define it, didn't talk about exclusivity or boundaries. We just kept meeting, kept exploring, each encounter adding another layer to what felt like this beautifully undefined connection. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to rush things or push for answers. I was just happy to be with him, to experience whatever this was with no expectations. One night, after a late movie, he reached for my hand in the dark of the theater, and in that small gesture, I felt something shift. I realized I was falling for him. Not in the frantic, overwhelming way I'd felt in past relationships, but in a slow, steady way, like sinking into something warm and familiar. I didn't say it though. I didn't want to break the unspoken agreement between us that this was just something beautiful we both shared, free from labels and expectations. But life has a way of testing even the best laid plans. One day, he mentioned a job offer he'd received out of state. It was the kind of opportunity he couldn't easily pass up, but when he told me, he looked at me with this hesitant expression, like he was expecting me to tell him not to go. My heart sank, but I couldn't be the one to hold him back. Instead, I smiled, congratulated him, and told him how incredible it was that he'd get to do something he loved. The last night we spent together was quiet, almost surreal. We didn't talk about what his leaving meant for us. We just enjoyed the silence, knowing that this chapter was coming to an end. And as I watched him walk away the next morning, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what could have been, but gratitude for every moment we'd shared, for the way he'd taught me to slow down, to live in the present. We still text sometimes, a sporadic exchange of inside jokes or random memories that remind us of those nights. And every time I cross that bridge at sunrise, I think of him, of that unexpected connection, of the laughter, and of the quiet moments that changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the most meaningful connections aren't the ones that last forever, but the ones that teach us to see life differently, to let go of expectations, and to appreciate the beauty of a single night shared with a stranger who, for a brief moment, feels like home. For us, it's the late-night drive. It started out as a way to clear our heads, but it's become this quiet ritual that makes everything else feel more manageable. Every once in a while, when the day's been especially long or our minds are too busy to relax, we'll look at each other and, without even needing to say a word, we know it's time. We'll grab our keys, slip on shoes, and head out into the night, letting the silence of the world calm us down. It all began one night, years ago, after a hard day that left us both in a strange, restless mood. We were sitting on the couch, both of us too drained to talk but too wired to go to bed. The air felt heavy, like there were words that needed to be said, but neither of us knew how. And then, out of nowhere, my partner stood up, grabbed the car keys, and said, "Come on, let's go for a drive." I didn't even ask where we were going. I just grabbed my jacket and followed them out the door. We ended up driving through empty streets, past sleeping neighborhoods and dark, silent stores. At first, we didn't say much. We just watched the glow of the streetlights flash by, the hum of the engine filling the quiet between us. But eventually, the words started to come, slowly, like water breaking through a dam. We talked about our day, about things that had been bothering us, even silly little things we wouldn't usually bring up. The darkness around us made it easier to say everything out loud, and before we knew it, we were laughing, our earlier worries feeling lighter somehow. By the time we headed home, we felt better, closer, like we'd left a little bit of the day's weight behind. After that night, the late-night drive became our thing. Whenever we felt that itch of restlessness, we'd take to the road. No plan, no destination, just us, the car, and the quiet night. Sometimes we'd go out just to listen to music, each of us taking turns playing whatever song was stuck in our heads. We'd let the lyrics fill the silence, sometimes singing along, sometimes just listening, feeling the way music has this magic of making you feel understood. There's one song that became our unofficial anthem. Every time we play it, we both grin, like we're sharing an inside joke no one else knows. One of my favorite drives was on a winter night, when it started snowing as we pulled out of the driveway. The roads were nearly empty, and the flakes were huge, drifting down slowly, making everything look like a dream. We didn't talk much. We just drove through those quiet streets, watching the snow blanket everything around us. It was surreal, like we were in our own little world, safe and warm, cocooned inside the car, while the outside became this sparkling winter wonderland. I remember glancing over at them, feeling this overwhelming sense of love and gratitude that we had found this quiet ritual that belonged only to us. It felt like the kind of memory you hold on to forever. Some nights, our drives would take us farther out, to places we didn't know. We'd pass empty gas stations, fields stretching out on either side, tiny towns with darkened windows and flickering streetlights. We'd joke that we were explorers, heading into the unknown, even though we knew we'd turn around and head back soon enough. Those drives became like mini adventures, a way to feel free and untethered, even if only for a little while. I think what I love most about the late night drive is that it's this space where we can just be ourselves, no expectations, no need for any big conversations. Some nights we barely talk at all, and it's just as meaningful as the nights we do. There's a kind of honesty in sitting beside someone in the dark, no distractions, just the road and the stars above. Those drives are when I feel most connected to them, even in the silence, because I know we're both there, sharing the same unspoken moment. One drive in particular stands out. We'd had a misunderstanding that week, one of those stupid arguments that drag on, leaving this lingering tension in the air. I felt it, and I knew they did too, but neither of us could find a way to bring it up. So, we did what we always do, we went for a drive. For the first few minutes, neither of us said a word. I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us, like a knot I didn't know how to untangle. But eventually, as we passed a dark stretch of highway, I took a deep breath and just said what I'd been feeling. They listened, nodding, and after a pause, they shared what had been on their mind too. In the darkness, it felt easier, like the car had given us permission to be vulnerable. By the time we got home, that tension had dissolved, and we both felt lighter, like we'd left that argument behind on some quiet stretch of road. Over time, our drives have become a kind of compass, a reminder that no matter what, we'll always find our way back to each other. There's this trust that's built up, this quiet understanding that when things get too much, we'll just take to the road, letting the rhythm of the wheels and the steady beat of the music soothe whatever's on our minds. Sometimes we'll end the night with a stop at a 24-hour diner for coffee and pie, like a little reward for making it through the week. We'll sit there in the booth, warm and a little drowsy, sharing bites of cherry pie, talking about everything and nothing. It's become our way of saying, we made it, a little celebration of us. The late-night drive has been our anchor, our escape, our way of hitting pause when life gets too loud. I know that even years from now, when things get tough or we just need a moment to breathe, we'll still have that tradition, that shared escape into the night. It's more than just a drive. It's our way of being there for each other, of saying, whatever happens, we've got this. The other night, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, as one does. And suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt this little burst of realization, like, wait a second, am I a wizard? Hear me out. I was lying there, wrapped in blankets, lights off, and I was casually moving entire worlds with my thumb. 1 minute, I'm watching someone cook elaborate meals in the mountains of Japan. Then I'm scrolling over to my bank app to check my balance. And in the next flick of my thumb, I'm looking at ancient ruins in Italy. Just a swipe, and boom, new world. I didn't have to get out of bed, and my only tool was a little rectangle of light. This thought starts spiraling, and I realize that basically everything in our lives has become like a low-key superpower. We're all running around with magical abilities, but nobody's calling it what it is. Like, take a random Tuesday. You wake up to a robotic voice that you chose, gently telling you the weather and news while it dims the lights to wake-up mode. Then you order groceries with a few taps, video call a friend on another continent, and finish the day streaming endless TV shows that tailor themselves based on what the algorithm thinks you like. It's like we've been given these godlike abilities, and instead of being amazed, we just nod and go, yeah, seems about right. One of my favorite little modern miracles is paying for things with my phone. Like, I'll be in line for coffee, and when I get to the register, I just wave my phone, and presto, my coffee is paid for, and I walk away feeling like I just cast a spell. It's so seamless and easy that sometimes I barely even notice it happened. But every once in a while, I'll think about how there was a time when I actually had to dig around for cash, count out change, and hand it over. Now I feel like I've transcended all that. I am a sorcerer of convenience. Or take something as simple as sending a message. I'll text a friend, and she'll reply instantly, even if she's on the other side of the country. It's just words popping up on a screen, but they carry her voice, her mood, even her timing. And I feel like I'm sitting next to her, having this intimate little moment in real time. But then I remember that it's literally traveling across hundreds, maybe thousands of miles in less than a second. The magic of it doesn't even register because we do it so often. It's like having telepathy with anyone, anywhere, anytime. Then there's the weird little dance of social media. I don't even have to ask people about their lives anymore because it's all right there, a never-ending reel of what everyone's up to. I know what my college roommate had for breakfast this morning, avocado toast, obviously, and where my old high school friend went on vacation. I'm aware of their kids, their pets, their hobbies, as if we've been chatting daily, even though we haven't spoken in years. It's like having this omniscient view of everyone's life without actually having to interact directly. And in a way, I kind of love it. I get to feel connected to people even though I might not see them for years. But still, when you stop to think about it, it's like we're all silently broadcasting to each other, sharing life through a constant, invisible telepathy. And then there's streaming. I remember a time when if you wanted to watch something, you actually had to wait for it to come on. Thursday at 8 p.m.? Oh no, I have soccer practice. But now, I just pick a show, hit play, and that's it. Every movie, every show, everything I could ever want is just there. It's like having the power to summon entertainment out of thin air. And what's even crazier is that the platforms start to learn what I like. If I've watched a few comedies, Netflix is suddenly my best friend saying, hey, you like to laugh? Here's 30 more shows. It's like it's reading my mind, Even driving feels like a secret skill now. I have a car with a GPS system that guides me wherever I need to go, and if I miss a turn, it just calmly reroutes. There's a kind of power in never needing to worry about being lost. The other day, I was visiting a friend in a new part of town, and I just followed the little dot on my phone. When I got there, I realized I hadn't even paid attention to the streets or landmarks. It was like I just teleported there. I used to think road trips were all about maps and planning, and now they're more like following a mystical blue arrow until it gets me there. Another strange little marvel is food delivery. I can scroll through a menu, tap a few buttons, and then just sit back as someone brings the meal directly to my door. The kicker is that I can even watch them on a map, like some enchanted tracking spell, slowly making their way through the streets to me. It's basically magic, and yet it feels almost ordinary. It doesn't matter that I'm ordering a 3-course meal from my couch while wearing pajamas. Nope, it's just a Tuesday, and this is what Tuesdays look like now. And have you noticed how we're all kind of telepathic when it comes to recommendations? I'll be talking about something random, like a new book I heard about, and then, as if by magic, that same book shows up as a recommendation in my social media feed. Or I'll mention a trip I'm planning to take, and suddenly every app one open has tips for that destination. It's like the world is tuned into our whispers and echoes them back. Honestly, if I didn't know better, I'd say the internet itself is sentient, keeping tabs on what I want before I even realize I want it. Then there's the whole concept of online shopping. I'll be scrolling through a website, adding things to my cart, and I don't even have to go through with it. The item will just follow me around online, showing up in ads and gently nudging me every few hours. Hey, remember me? That sweater you almost bought? I'm still here. It's like having a little ghost assistant that follows my whims and reminds me of my forgotten shopping sprees. Honestly, the strangest part is how normal this all feels. Every day we're walking around in this world of digital assistants, instant messages, automated everything, and we're completely unfazed by it. We don't even marvel at how, with a few taps, we can access nearly any piece of knowledge humans have ever compiled. We're just too busy trying to remember where we put our car keys, not realizing that we're living lives that people 100 years ago would probably consider supernatural. Maybe the most magical part of all this is that we get to stay connected in ways that go beyond space and time. My grandpa texts me from his iPad about the most random things, like a new pasta recipe or a joke he heard at the gym. He's 80 and halfway across the country, but somehow we're having real-time conversations about garlic and stand-up comedy. And he sends emojis like they're hieroglyphics, which honestly makes our conversations even better. So, I guess that's where I've landed with this whole thing. We're all walking around, acting like everything is business as usual, even though we're casting tiny spells every day. Ordering coffee, paying bills, learning new skills, connecting with loved ones. All of it happens instantly, almost effortlessly. If that's not magic, I don't know what is. So, here's what I'm curious about. What's one everyday thing you do that feels a little bit magical when you stop and think about it? The letter came in the middle of a Tuesday, folded up in a thin, white envelope, tucked between bills and junk mail. It was handwritten, slightly shaky cursive in black ink, with my name on the front. I knew the handwriting immediately. It was my grandfather's, though I hadn't seen it in years. He hadn't sent letters in a long time. Mostly, he left quiet, clipped voicemails, or sometimes called out of the blue to ask me if I'd heard about some neighbor's prize roses, or to remind me of the weather, as if I could do anything about it from 100 miles away. This letter, though, it wasn't small talk. He was asking for help. In 2 days, I was pulling up to his house, a place that had been as much my home as my own growing up. His old Victorian stood as it always had, leaning slightly on one side, a big, gangly structure that looked out over the town's lake with its big bay windows. I could feel my childhood self in every detail. The crack in the front step where I used to leave stones, the uneven front door that had always required a hard push. Grandpa was waiting for me on the porch, his eyes narrowed as he watched me approach, like he wasn't quite convinced I'd show up. "You made good time," he said, his voice softer than I remembered, but his words firm. He didn't smile, but he looked me up and down approvingly, as if sizing up if I was still fit to lift boxes or haul furniture. That was Grandpa, always keeping practical things in mind. He held the door open, and I walked in, immediately surrounded by the familiar smell of wood polish and old books, mixed with something slightly musty. I'd spent countless summers here, running through these rooms, the walls so full of books and maps and peculiar artifacts that I'd once felt like I was living in a museum. Now, though, everything looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated the banister, and the stacks of books in the study seemed taller, more precarious. After a few minutes of polite talk and uncomfortable silences, he finally got to the point. "I need you to help me pack it all up," he said simply, as if it was just another task like fixing a squeaky door. Time for me to let go of a few things. I tried to hide my surprise. This was the same man who had insisted for decades that the house was his masterpiece, his legacy. It was hard to believe he was willing to part with any of it. But I nodded, following his lead. Grandpa's way was to never make a fuss, even if a fuss was the only thing that made sense. He handed me a stack of boxes, and we spent the first day in the study, sifting through his endless collection of old, weathered books. Some were classics, others barely held together, and some were so obscure I couldn't pronounce the titles. I could feel his eyes on me every so often, as if trying to gauge what I thought of each choice he made. To keep, to toss, to let go. We spent the next few days combing through his possessions, artifacts and keepsakes that had felt like treasures to me as a kid. I found a tiny wooden elephant I used to hide in my pocket whenever I came over, a little piece of good luck I'd carried everywhere back then. I handed it to him, hoping for some reaction, but he only held it up to the light and shrugged, dropping it back in the keep pile. One evening, as the sun set behind the lake, he asked if I'd go through the basement. "Too many steps," he grunted, waving his hand dismissively. "You know how it is." The basement had always scared me as a kid. The creaky stairs, the dim lighting, the shelves lined with things I'd never quite recognized. But I agreed, knowing this was what he needed. I found the old pull chain and tugged, the single bulb overhead casting a yellow light that barely reached the edges of the room. I started opening boxes, finding layers of his life and the lives of people I'd never known. Old dishes wrapped in newspaper, maps with markings in faded ink, jars full of what looked like beach sand. And then, buried beneath a pile of blankets, I found a small, dented tin box. When I opened it, I found letters stacked tightly, some of the envelopes brittle, the ink faded. I pulled one out, seeing my grandfather's handwriting, only neater, younger. These were love letters addressed to my grandmother. She had died before I was born, but her presence had always lingered in the house. Photos, her wedding ring on a chain in Grandpa's drawer, and the way he'd speak of her so quietly, so reverently. The letters were filled with small, ordinary things. The scent of the roses in her garden, the warmth of her smile on a cold night, memories of places they'd gone together. I couldn't stop reading, feeling like I'd stumbled into a hidden part of his life he'd never let anyone see. The next morning, I brought the box upstairs, setting it gently on the kitchen table. He looked down at it, his face expressionless, but his hands trembled slightly as he touched the lid. "I thought I'd lost these," he said after a long pause, his voice low. "Haven't seen them in years." We sat in silence, the box between us, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, he looked up at me, his face softer than I'd ever seen it. "She was everything, you know. Not in the big ways people talk about, but in the small, quiet ways. In the things that linger even when you try to let them go." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. I could feel the weight of it all. The years, the loss, the memories he'd carried all this time without ever saying a word. We didn't talk much after that, but something shifted between us. He let me take charge of the packing, only occasionally glancing over at me as I sorted through what remained of his life here. Each item, each box, each memory felt like a piece of him, like I was helping him lift a weight he'd been carrying alone for far too long. On my last day, he walked me out to my car, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. "Take care of yourself, kiddo," he said, his voice gruff but soft, a strange mix of the man I'd always known and the one I'd just met. I nodded, giving him a quick hug, knowing it was all we could handle. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, standing against the sky like an old friend saying goodbye. I knew he'd stay there a little longer, that he wasn't leaving anytime soon, but I felt he'd finally begun to let go, to make peace with everything he'd held so close. And as I hit the open road, I felt something shift in me to a quiet sense of closure, of having seen a piece of my family, my past, in a way I hadn't before. It happened on one of those forgotten afternoons, the kind where nothing much was going on. I was in my hometown for a long overdue visit, and out of sheer nostalgia, I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood. It had been years since I had wandered those streets. Things were different, of course, new houses, a few shops replaced with trendy cafes, but mostly the bones of the place were the same. As I meandered down familiar sidewalks, I felt a strange urge to take a detour. There was a side street I'd passed a million times as a kid, but had never thought much about. No particular reason why. I guess it had just never called to me. But that day, I felt a pull, something like curiosity layered with déjà vu. So I turned down the narrow, tree-lined lane, feeling half like I was exploring and half like I was retracing steps I'd somehow missed. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, the air dense with the kind of stillness that makes you feel as if you're standing on the edge of something. I walked slowly, scanning the houses and small yards, when something unusual caught my eye, a sign tucked between two massive oak trees at the end of the lane. It was carved from dark wood, its letters worn and fading, barely visible in the shadows cast by the branches overhead. It read simply, "The Garden of Small Hours." I stopped, wondering if it was a new park or some quirky neighborhood landmark. The trees parted just enough to reveal a narrow path, half hidden by ferns and ivy, winding off into what seemed to be a small clearing. I felt the oddest urge to follow it. I stepped carefully onto the path, feeling an almost childlike excitement as I made my way through the underbrush. I had no idea what to expect, and somehow, that was the best part. After only a few steps, I found myself emerging into a clearing that seemed like something out of a dream. The air was warm, and the light was soft, golden, as if I'd entered a perpetual sunset. Flowers I couldn't name bloomed in neat but meandering rows, their petals painted in every shade of red, orange, and violet. At the center of the clearing was a small, wrought iron bench, painted in peeling green, with 2 cups of steaming tea resting on a low, wooden table in front of it. I glanced around, wondering if someone was waiting here or if I'd somehow stumbled into someone's secret garden. But no one appeared. The cups sat there as if they'd been left just for me. I don't know why, but I felt a strange compulsion to sit down. The whole place felt timeless, like it existed in a pocket of reality where minutes and hours were gently ignored, where I could pause and simply be without the weight of expectation. I sat down, my gaze drifting to the second cup on the table. Without thinking, I lifted it and took a sip. The tea was warm, soothing, with a taste I couldn't quite place. It was earthy, a little floral, and somehow nostalgic. I felt a calm settle over me as I took in the garden, the colors shifting softly in the fading light. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. In fact, I felt a warmth of connection, as though I were sitting with someone who understood me deeply, someone who needed no words to share in this quiet, peaceful moment. I must have lost track of time because, eventually, the light began to fade, casting the garden in cooler, darker shades. I stood up, reluctant to leave, but something told me that this place wasn't meant to be lingered in for too long. I took one last look, my heart full of something I couldn't name, and walked back to the path, feeling like I was carrying a secret out of that garden and back into the world. As I made my way home, I thought about that place, wondering if it had been a dream or some fleeting trick of the imagination. But in my hand, I was still holding the teacup, cool now and nearly empty, but real. It was decorated with small, intricate patterns of leaves and vines, painted in faded blues and greens. Proof, somehow, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Later that night, when I was back in my old room, I placed the cup on my nightstand and tried to get some sleep. I drifted off quickly, but my dreams were vivid, filled with images of the garden, the soft glow, the scent of warm tea, the way the flowers seemed to bloom in slow motion. I woke up with the faintest scent of tea lingering on my pillow. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn back to that street, hoping to find the Garden of Small Hours again. to feel that gentle peace I'd found there. But each time I returned, the sign was gone. The narrow path was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an ordinary tangle of brush and trees. I couldn't find any trace of it, no matter how many times I retraced my steps. The teacup sits on my shelf now, a quiet reminder of that strange, magical afternoon. Sometimes, when I'm especially overwhelmed or tired, I'll hold it in my hands and close my eyes, feeling that warm glow wash over me again, the memory of the garden settling over me like a soft blanket. I never saw the Garden of Small Hours again, but somehow it feels like it's still out there, waiting in that pocket of time. Maybe it's waiting for someone else now. Someone who needs a moment of peace or a reminder of something they didn't know they'd lost. And maybe that's what the Garden of Small Hours is, a place that finds you when you need it, offering you a moment outside of time, a pause in the rush of life. Have you ever found a place that felt like a secret meant just for you, even if it only existed for a little? There was this kid named Lyle in my high school. He wasn't one of the popular kids, but he wasn't exactly invisible either. Lyle had this knack for showing up in weird places and knowing things about people, stuff he had no business knowing. People joked that he could slip through walls, that he could read minds, even that he was some kind of spy. He had this strange, intense curiosity, like the world was his personal mystery to solve. But it wasn't until junior year that I realized just how far Lyle's curiosity went. It all started when the school got a new principal, Ms. Harker. She was tough, old school, and rumored to have a background in military intelligence, though that was probably just a rumor. She arrived on the first day, looking like she was on a mission with this focused, no-nonsense energy that made everyone instantly sit up straighter. She made it clear that things were about to change, that discipline and order would be the new motto. The teachers loved her, but we? Not so much. Lal seemed particularly fascinated with Ms. Harker. He'd watch her from the back of the classroom whenever she came in for surprise inspections, his eyes following her every move. He started disappearing during lunch, and every time he came back, he'd have some new, strange tidbit to share. She's been in the basement, he told me once, his voice low and serious. She spends hours down there. Doing what? I have no idea. The basement was this off-limits area of the school that nobody knew much about. There was an old sign above the door that said archives in faded letters, but no one ever saw anyone going in or out. When Lal told me about it, I shrugged it off. It was just Lal being Lal, I thought, but he couldn't let it go. Every day, he'd come up to me with more updates. I heard a noise from there last night, he said once. It sounded like, I don't know, like something heavy being dragged. And then, one day, Lal asked me the question that set everything in motion. Do you want to see what's down there? At first, I laughed it off, but the way he looked at me made me stop. There was a spark of something in his eyes. Excitement, sure, but something darker too. Curiosity that went too deep. I didn't answer him right away, but I felt a thrill of nervous excitement. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The plan was simple enough. We'd sneak into the basement after the school dance on Friday, when everyone would be distracted and the place would be deserted. All week, Lal was strangely quiet, like he was mentally preparing himself for whatever we might find. When Friday finally came, we waited for the dance to hit its peak, then slipped out and headed down the hall to the basement door. It was locked, of course, but Lyle had a trick for that. He pulled out a small metal tool he'd borrowed from the auto shop and fiddled with the lock until it clicked open. We crept down the stairs, the air getting colder with every step. The smell was the first thing that hit me, a stale, musty odor that seemed ancient. I could barely see in front of me, but Lyle had a flashlight, and he moved it around, casting shadows against the walls. The place was bigger than I expected, a long, empty corridor with doors lining each side. I half expected to see skeletons or ancient books covered in dust, but it was just concrete floors and blank walls, like an unfinished part of the school that had been abandoned halfway. At the end of the corridor, there was a door with a metal plate that said Records Room. Lyle's eyes lit up when he saw it, and before I could stop him, he opened the door and stepped inside. The room was packed with old filing cabinets, each one labeled with different years. Boxes of papers were stacked against the walls, and there was a smell of mildew and decaying paper. Lyle walked along the rows of cabinets, running his fingers over the labels. "Look at this," he whispered, pulling open one of the drawers. Inside were files on students from years ago, complete with report cards, photos, notes from teachers. It was like the whole history of the school was stored down here, hidden away. He flipped through a few of the files, looking for something, though what I had no idea. "You won't believe some of this," he said, holding up a file that showed a picture of a student from decades ago, the word expulsion stamped in red across the top. It's like they kept a record of every screw-up, every mistake, even stuff they should have destroyed a long time ago. Just as we were about to leave, Lyle's flashlight caught something on the wall. A small door, painted to match the wall, nearly invisible in the darkness. We both froze, staring at it. Without a word, Lyle walked over and pulled it open. Behind it was another, smaller room, this one with just a single filing cabinet in the center. Unlike the others, this cabinet was locked with a heavy padlock. Lyle looked at me, his eyes gleaming. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what I came for." I wanted to tell him to stop, that this was insane, but I didn't. He pulled a bobby pin from his pocket, worked at the lock, and it finally clicked open. Inside, there was only one file. It was thin, barely a few pages, with no label or markings. Lyle opened it, and I watched as his face went pale. He didn't speak for a moment, just kept staring at the file like he was seeing a ghost. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He handed it to me, and as I looked at the first page, my heart dropped. It was a list of names, our names, mine, his, and a few others from our class, along with photos and handwritten notes. The notes described our habits, our weaknesses, even things I'd never told anyone. My hands shook as I flipped through it, realizing that someone had been watching us, tracking us, like we were part of some experiment. And then at the very back, there was a photo of Ms. Harker. But she wasn't listed as the principal. Next to her name was a title that read, Head Researcher. We both stared at it, our minds spinning. What did it mean? Why would they keep files on us, on our personal lives? Were we part of some study, something sinister that they didn't want us to know about? Just then, we heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. Someone was coming. We shoved the file back into the drawer, relocked it, and crept out of the room as quietly as we could. We barely made it out before the door at the top of the stairs opened, and a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. We slipped down another hall and hid in the shadows, our hearts pounding, watching as Ms. Harker herself walked into the basement, her gaze sharp and suspicious. The next day, Lyle didn't show up to school. I waited for him at lunch, at his locker, but he never came. When I asked around, people said he'd transferred out overnight. No warning, no goodbye. I tried calling him, texting him, but his number was disconnected. It was like he'd vanished off the face of the earth. The following Monday, I found a note slipped into my locker. It was in Lyle's handwriting, and all it said was, "They're watching. Don't let them know you know." I never spoke of what happened that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I'd see someone outside my window, a shadow that disappeared as soon as I looked. And every time I walk past the basement door at school, I feel a chill, wondering if Lyle ever made it out, or if he's still down there somewhere, lost in that labyrinth of secrets. It started at a bar that I wasn't supposed to be at. I'd gone out with a group of friends, planning for a quick drink and maybe a game of pool, but then I saw her. She was sitting at the bar, sipping a glass of red wine with a book open in front of her, the kind of person who didn't care about fitting into a scene. She had this effortless vibe, and without thinking, I made my way over and said, "What's a person gotta read to get a drink around here?" She looked up, half smiling, eyes sizing me up. "Apparently, anything Hemingway," she replied, tapping her book, and just like that, we started talking. Her name was Zara, and she was the type who didn't just make conversation. She made moments. We talked about everything from travel to the best ways to cook eggs, and I found myself mesmerized. Her laugh was this bright, contagious thing, and her stories were laced with all these tiny, vivid details that made me feel like I'd known her forever. That night, we stayed out long after our friends left, wandering through empty streets, stealing moments that felt like they belonged to us alone. When we finally parted, she gave me a look, half skeptical, half playful, and said, "See you around?" like it was a dare. I couldn't help but take her up on it. After that, we were a whirlwind. We'd meet up in the most random places, at food trucks, on the steps of an old library, under streetlights at midnight. Every time felt like a stolen adventure, like we were playing hooky from the rest of the world. Zara had this way of being unapologetically herself, dragging me into her world of spur-of-the-moment ideas. She'd text me out of the blue, "Get ready, I'm kidnapping you." And I'd find myself at some obscure art show or a late-night bakery, her laughter echoing through the empty streets. I'd never met anyone like her, someone who seemed to live entirely in the present moment, who could make even the ordinary feel like magic. There was this one night we ended up on a rooftop, sitting on the ledge with our legs dangling off the side, watching the city lights. She was telling me about her dream of opening a little shop in some quiet coastal town, a place where she could make jewelry and people could come to escape. She said it so casually, like it was as simple as deciding what to eat for dinner, and I found myself picturing a life where that could actually happen, where we could just pack up and start fresh, no strings attached. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have that with her. I don't know when exactly I fell in love with her. It might have been one of those late-night adventures, or maybe just in the quiet moments, like when we'd stay in, cooking breakfast in the middle of the night, dancing barefoot in the kitchen. She had this habit of leaning her head on my shoulder, sighing contentedly like everything was perfect just as it was. She'd smile up at me, and for a moment, it was easy to imagine that we'd always be like this, two people lost in each other, untouched by the world. But as bright as things felt with Zara, there was always this undercurrent, a hint of something slipping away, like she was always half here, half somewhere else. I noticed it in small ways. She'd go quiet at times, staring off with this faraway look, or change the subject if I tried to talk about the future. One night, she disappeared for a few days without a word, and when she came back, she just shrugged it off, saying she needed a little space. I wanted to ask what was going on, but I didn't. I was afraid if I pushed too hard, she'd vanish completely. Then, one afternoon, she called me out of the blue, her voice shaky in a way I'd never heard before. She asked if we could meet, and something in her tone told me it was important. I raced over, my heart pounding, a part of me already fearing what was coming. When I found her, she was sitting alone on a bench by the river, her face pale, her usual spark dulled. She looked up at me, managing a weak smile, and patted the spot beside her. I sat down, waiting, not daring to say a word. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "I have to go." She explained in halting words that she was moving, that she'd gotten an opportunity somewhere far away, a chance to start fresh, to find herself, as she put it. She looked at me, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "I thought I could stay, thought I could be what you needed. But I'm not. I'm just not." I sat there, speechless, feeling my world unravel as she spoke. I wanted to tell her to stay, to promise her that we could figure it out, that she didn't need to run. But deep down, I knew this was who she was, someone who needed to be free, to follow her own path, even if it meant leaving things behind. I tried to hold it together, managed a nod, a weak smile, as if that could somehow make it hurt less. We hugged, a silent goodbye, and I held on a little too long, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between us. After she left, the city felt emptier. I kept expecting her to show up at my door, or to get one of her texts telling me to meet her at some random spot. But she was gone, leaving me with fragments of memories, little pieces of a life that almost was. I'd go back to the places we'd been, hoping to feel her presence, to somehow fill the void she left. But it was never the same. The city was just a city again, and I was just another person in it, left to wander through the memories of someone who was as fleeting as a summer breeze. It's been months now, and I still think about her sometimes. I wonder where she is, what she's doing, if she's found what she was looking for. I wonder if she ever thinks of me, or if I was just one more stop on her journey, a fleeting chapter in her ever-moving story. I try to move on, to meet new people, to let someone else in, but there's a part of me that's still holding on that can't let go of the idea of her. She was a storm, intense and beautiful, impossible to hold on to. And yet, a part of me still waits, hoping that one day she'll come back and tell me that she's ready to stay. Okay, I'm not usually one for life-changing epiphanies, but my dog just showed me something that hit way too close to home. And yes, I realize how that sounds, but bear with me. So, I have this rescue dog named Ollie. He's this scruffy little thing with giant ears and a big personality packed into a small, furry body. Ollie has a few quirks, as all good rescue dogs do, but recently he started doing something that totally threw me off. Every morning, as soon as I'd open the door to let him out into the yard, he'd dash outside, stop dead in his tracks, and just sit there. Not running around, not sniffing every blade of grass like usual. Just sitting, staring at absolutely nothing. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for some invisible neighborhood cat to appear, or maybe he discovered a particularly mesmerizing piece of sky. But it kept happening. Day after day, he'd sprint outside like he'd just heard the dinner bell, and then plop. Ollie would sit frozen, like he was lost in his own little doggy thoughts. It started driving me crazy, honestly. I mean, I got things to do. I'd stand there tapping my foot, waiting for him to move, muttering things like, "Come on, buddy, let's go," or "We've got to schedule Ollie," as if my dog understood the concept of Google Calendar. But Ollie wasn't budging. Eventually, I'd just stand there with him, waiting for him to decide he was done with his existential crisis so I could move on with my day. Then one morning I woke up extra early by accident, like the sun was just barely coming up. And as soon as I got up, Ollie was right there, ready for his daily stare session. This time, without the usual rush to get out the door for work, I decided to just let him do his thing. I grabbed my coffee, followed him outside, and sat down beside him. There we were, the two of us sitting on the grass, doing absolutely nothing. And after a few minutes, something funny happened. I actually started noticing the things around us. The quiet stillness of the early morning, the way the first light was filtering through the trees, the sound of a bird somewhere doing its morning routine. I mean, I've lived in this neighborhood for years, but this felt like the first time I'd really seen it. As I sat there, I realized that Ollie's little ritual wasn't just him being weird. He was actually enjoying his surroundings. Meanwhile, I'd been so caught up in my schedule, constantly rushing him along, trying to keep to some imaginary timeline, that I hadn't stopped to just exist in who knows how long. I'm always thinking about the next task, the next meeting, the next errand, so much so that I forget to be present for any of it. So that morning, I let myself sit there as long as Ollie wanted. And when he was finally ready to move, I got up with him, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. Since then, I've been trying to carve out a few Ollie moments in my day. I go outside without my phone, sip my coffee in silence, and just sit. It's honestly wild how something so simple can make such a difference. Now Ollie's weird habit has turned into our shared morning ritual. I like to think he was trying to teach me to slow down all along, or maybe he's just stubborn. I'll never know. But I can say for sure that he's shown me how important it is to find those small pockets of peace, even when everything feels busy and overwhelming. So, here's my question. Has anyone else learned an unexpected lesson from their pet? Or maybe found a strange habit that forced you to slow down and see things differently? So this all happened on my first solo trip abroad. I just graduated, had a bit of saved up cash, and was determined to find myself by wandering around Europe with zero plans and even less of an itinerary. Naturally, I ended up in Paris, the city of romance, art, and sophistication. I had big dreams of strolling along the Seine, maybe writing a deep, introspective journal entry or two. On my second day there, I'm wandering aimlessly through this artsy neighborhood when I see a sign on the side of a small theater. Free mime class today. All levels welcome. Now, I'd never considered mime as something I'd, do, but I'd always found it fascinating. Plus, free class? Sure, why not? I figured it would be a fun, quirky experience. At the very least, I could watch a bunch of people pretend to be stuck in imaginary boxes. I walk in, and the place is exactly what you'd expect. Dim lights, a little stage, and a group of people dressed in black and white stripes, some even wearing berets. I start to feel a bit self-conscious in my jeans and t-shirt, but hey, I'm already here. There's a man at the front with this wild, curly hair, pacing back and forth. He's got the dramatic flair of someone who's either a mime or a mad scientist. And as soon as I step in, he turns to me with a big smile. "You are here to find the silence within, yes?" he asks in this deep, serious voice. I laugh nervously, nodding, though in truth, I wasn't exactly sure what I'd come to find. He waves me in and tells me to take a spot on the floor. I glance around, half expecting someone to start talking, but nope. Silence. Total complete silence. The instructor, whose name was Philippe, starts by instructing us to close our eyes and become the essence of stillness. All right, I think I can do this. I close my eyes, trying not to giggle as I hear a few people breathing very dramatically beside me. Philippe paces around, giving these abstract instructions like, feel your inner glass walls and be one with the invisible forces. I'm doing my best to take it seriously, but it's like he's describing scenes from a sci-fi movie. And then he announces that it's time for expressions. He points to me, and I suddenly realize he's asking me to stand up and perform. I look around, hoping he's actually pointing to someone behind me, but nope, it's me. I start to feel that rising panic of being called on in class when you haven't done the reading. Imagine, he says, you are walking against the wind. But the wind, she pushes back. He's gesturing grandly, looking at me with such intensity that I figure, okay, I'll give it a try. I start leaning forward, pretending to brace myself against this imaginary gale. But then he gets right up close, studying me with these narrowed eyes, and shakes his head. No. You must be the wind, he says. The wind, she is not outside you. She is inside. And with that, he starts doing it himself. Leaning so far forward, he looks like he's about to fall, moving his arms in these exaggerated, swooping motions that are somewhere between a bird and a leaf caught in a storm. The rest of the class is watching with dead serious expressions, like they're witnessing some profound art. I try my best to mimic him, waving my arms and leaning into it, but I'm feeling about as ridiculous as a person can feel. As I'm pretending to fight this imaginary wind, I catch a glimpse of myself in a mirror on the far wall. I'm sweaty, waving my arms like a maniac, and squinting with a look of pure concentration. I realize that I look less like a mime and more like someone frantically searching for an exit in a crowded club. It takes every ounce of willpower not to burst out laughing. Philippe claps, signaling it's time for a new exercise. He starts going around the room, giving each person a scenario to act out in silence. There's one guy miming that he's trapped in an invisible box. Classic. Another pretending to pull an imaginary rope. Then it's my turn again. Philippe leans in close and says, now you are Z tree. A tall, strong tree. But Z wind, she is powerful. She tests you. I nod, trying to absorb this poetic wisdom and do my best to embody a tree. I'm swaying back and forth, my branches moving slowly as I imagine this mighty force pushing against me. And then, just as I'm starting to feel slightly more confident, a couple walks into the theater, clearly tourists just looking for directions. They take one look at me, arms raised, swaying in total silence, and quickly back out like they've walked into some kind of cult meeting. I'm trying not to laugh, but the whole thing is just too absurd. Here I am, in Paris, finding my inner tree in a mime class I never planned on joining, while a couple of confused tourists run for the hills. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the class ends. Philippe gathers us around, placing a hand on his chest. You have all done magnificently, he says. Remember, mime is not about what is seen. It is about what is felt in here. He taps his heart, and I can tell he means every word. Walking out of there, I couldn't stop smiling. I came to Paris expecting an art gallery tour or maybe a cooking class, and instead I got an accidental crash course in silent performance art. But honestly, that class, as strange and awkward as it was, made me feel so alive. For 3 minutes, I'd thrown my self-consciousness to the wind, literally, embraced the ridiculousness, and just went with it. Since then, anytime I find myself hesitating to try something new or worrying about how I might look, I think back to that mime class in Paris and remember Philippe's words. You must be the wind. It sounds silly, but sometimes life really is just about leaning into the moment, even if it makes you look like an absolute fool. A few days ago, I was going through a stack of random boxes in the attic. I've been meaning to clean it out for years, but you know how it goes, out of sight, out of mind. Anyway, I was sorting through the usual collection of dusty holiday decorations and forgotten junk when my hand brushed against something cold and metallic. Curious, I pulled it out, and immediately I froze. It was an old Viewmaster, the chunky, red plastic kind where you'd insert those circular reels and click through pictures of far-off places and cartoon characters. It was a little scuffed up, but still intact with a reel already loaded. Just holding it took me right back to summer afternoons at my grandparents' house. I could feel it as if I'd just been there, me probably around 7 years old, curled up on their big, plaid couch, peering through that Viewmaster like it was a portal to a world nobody else could see. I clicked it open, curious to see which reel was inside, and when I held it up to the light, I nearly laughed out loud. It was one of those old nature series, the kind with overly vibrant photos of rainforests, waterfalls, and animals that I used to obsess over. I was hit with a memory so vivid that for a second, I swear I could smell my grandma's lavender perfume, hear the tick-tock of their grandfather clock, and feel the scratchy fabric of that old couch under my legs. Back then, that Viewmaster was my treasure, my key to exploring places I was convinced I'd go to one day. I'd flip through those slides, creating little stories around each one. The tropical parrot was my sidekick. The distant mountains were my kingdom to explore. Standing there in the attic, I couldn't help but click through the reel, holding it up to the tiny window to catch the fading evening light, even though I was far too old for it now. But as each slide clicked into place, I felt like I was falling right back into that childhood wonder. I remembered how my grandparents' house had felt like my own personal kingdom. My grandpa was always tinkering with things in the garage, showing me how to hammer nails into scrap wood, while my grandma would sit in the garden, humming softly as she watered her flowers. Those long, lazy summer days where the hours stretched on forever, and every little thing was an adventure waiting to happen. I could almost hear my grandma's voice calling me for lunch, which was usually something simple, PB&J sandwiches with little carrot sticks on the side. She'd serve it on these pastel-colored plates with little flowers on the edges, and she'd pour my juice into a fancy glass, one of those tiny glasses they kept in the back of the cupboard. To a kid, it felt like a royal feast. I'd sit there, Viewmaster in hand, flipping through the images even as I ate, telling her all about the places I'd just visited. She'd listen like she was truly interested, asking me questions about the animals I'd seen or the caves I'd explored, as if I'd really been on some grand adventure. I didn't realize until that moment, standing there in my attic, how much those afternoons meant to me. That feeling of being totally, unconditionally welcomed, like their home was my home, like everything I said or dreamed up mattered. I remembered how my grandma would gently pat my hand and say, "One day, you're going to see all those places for real," and how I believed her without a doubt in my mind. I'd go back to that couch, holding the Viewmaster up to my face with one eye closed, squinting as I clicked through each reel, each scene bringing me closer to the world she'd promised I'd someday see. I don't know how long I stood there in the attic, lost in that memory. At some point, I realized I had tears in my eyes. Happy tears, but still unexpected. I'd forgotten how magical those afternoons felt, how much those little rituals had shaped me. It's funny how a small, seemingly insignificant object can be the doorway to a memory you didn't even know you were missing. Eventually, I put the Viewmaster down, but I knew I couldn't just toss it back into the box. Instead, I brought it downstairs and placed it on my shelf, a reminder of all those quiet afternoons spent in a world where anything felt possible. So now I'm wondering, have you ever stumbled upon something random that brought back a memory so clear you could practically reach out and touch it? Every once in a while, I catch myself smiling over the smallest memories, things that seemed so ordinary when they happened, but now have this glow, like they were painted over with some magical warmth. They're quiet moments, the kind you only really appreciate looking back, like a faded photograph you find tucked in a book. Here's one that always makes me pause, feel that little spark of joy all over again. There was this one autumn Saturday when I was probably 8 or 9, and my dad took me to this tiny apple orchard on the edge of town. It was late October, so the trees were already half bare, but a few red and green apples still clung to the branches. The air was crisp, cold enough to need a sweater, but not so much that it hurt to breathe. We wandered through the rows, filling a little basket, and I remember my dad laughing as he lifted me up to reach one of the apples that was too perfect to leave behind. After a while, We sat on a bench, munching on the apples right there, the juice sticky on our fingers. It wasn't anything big, just a quiet morning with a little warmth from the sun and the crunch of apples. But I remember feeling like I was in my own small, perfect world. And then, of course, there were those Friday nights with my cousins. Every so often, our families would meet up, and once we'd wolf down dinner, the parents would give us the green light to go play. For us, that meant slipping down to the basement, which felt like our own little universe. We'd switch off the lights, close the door, and play hide and seek in the dark. It was always a mix of terror and thrill as we'd creep around, listening for each other, barely breathing, so we wouldn't give away our spots. We'd stifle laughs, hiding behind dusty boxes or under tables, trying not to scream when someone jumped out from the shadows. Eventually, someone would trip or knock something over, and we'd all burst out laughing, the kind that makes you feel like you're running out of air, but in the best way. It was pure, unfiltered joy, the kind that stays with you even when you're way too old for basement hide and seek. I also think back to summer evenings with my mom, where we'd go for these long, slow walks around the neighborhood just as the sun was setting. She'd point out all her favorite flowers, stopping to admire some rose bushes or peonies that grew wild around a neighbor's fence. Sometimes we'd take detours, walking down streets we'd never explored, just to see where they'd lead. We'd talk about everything and nothing, little things like school and what I wanted for my next birthday, and bigger things like what I thought I wanted to be when I grew up. She'd tell me stories from when she was my age, and I remember listening, trying to imagine her as a kid, walking those same streets. Even now, I think back to those quiet walks, just the two of us with no rush to be anywhere, and I feel that warmth, like those evenings are still tucked away somewhere, just waiting for me. And let's not forget the magic of the first snowfall each winter. I remember one year in particular when I was about 6. I'd woken up, looked outside, and saw the whole world transformed. Everything blanketed in a layer of untouched, sparkling snow. My dad bundled me up in what felt like 100 layers, and we went outside just as the sun was rising. The snow was so thick and powdery that we left perfect little tracks wherever we walked. We spent what felt like hours just walking around the neighborhood, barely saying a word, letting the snow crunch under our boots. At one point, he stopped, looked at me with a grin, and threw the biggest snowball he could make. I was shocked for a second, then burst out laughing, and we spent the rest of the morning in an epic snowball fight. By the time we finally went inside, I was soaked, freezing, but so ridiculously happy. That morning felt like magic, like the world had put on its most beautiful dress just for us. One of my favorite memories from school was this random talent show that I almost chickened out of. I was maybe 12, and somehow I convinced myself that I should sing in front of everyone, even though I was terrified. Right before I was supposed to go on, I felt the nerves hit hard. My stomach was doing flips, my hands were shaking, and I was pretty much ready to disappear. But then, from the wings of the stage, I saw my best friend in the audience, giving me the biggest thumbs up and mouthing, "You got this." Somehow, that tiny gesture made me feel brave enough to go out there. I don't even remember how I sounded, but I remember looking out and seeing her cheering me on, the look on her face like she was proud of me just for trying. It's one of those memories I hold on to when things get rough. That reminder that even the smallest support can make you feel unstoppable. And of course, there's the classic summer road trip with my family. We didn't do anything extravagant, just loaded up the car, packed way too many snacks, and hit the road. I'd sit in the back seat, trying to entertain myself by counting license plates or making up stories about the people in the cars we passed. My parents would put on old songs, the kind that they grew up with, and we'd all end up singing along, laughing when someone got the words completely wrong. Somewhere along the way, we'd pull over at a random roadside diner, stretching our legs, ordering pancakes at odd hours just because we could. There was one trip where we stopped by a little river just because it looked pretty and spent an hour skipping rocks and watching the water sparkle under the sun. It wasn't about where we were going. It was the feeling of being together, of every small moment turning into something we'd all remember. And then there's this tiny memory of my grandma that's so vivid it almost feels like it just happened. I was sitting in her kitchen, watching her bake pies for the holidays. She had this way of moving around the kitchen, calm and careful, humming softly to herself. Every so often, She'd pass me a little scrap of pie crust, dusted in sugar and cinnamon, and tell me I was her official taste tester. I remember the smell of the pies baking, the warmth of the oven, the way the sugar sparkled on the little crust scraps. She'd talk about all the recipes she'd learned from her own mom, the way each pie was a little piece of history. I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but now, every time I make a pie, it feels like she's there in the kitchen with me, like those little scraps of memory are still sweet and warm, carrying her love along with them. It's funny looking back, these memories aren't big or flashy. They're simple moments, the kinds of things you barely think about as they happen. But now, they're the ones I hold closest. They remind me of times when life felt easy, when happiness wasn't something I had to chase, but something that was just there, filling up the everyday moments. I think maybe that's why these memories feel so comforting. They remind me of what it feels like to be present, to be surrounded by love in the smallest ways. So, what's that one small memory you hold on to? The one that just makes you feel like you're wrapped in a blanket of warmth whenever it crosses your mind? I was sitting in the park the other day, just people watching while I scrolled through my phone, when I had this surreal thought. We're all sort of living in this quiet science fiction reality, but we're pretending it's just normal. Take a look around. Everyone's holding these tiny screens that not only tell us the time, but connect us instantly to anyone we know, anywhere in the world. And no one's amazed by this. It's like we've all agreed to treat it like it's no more interesting than a spoon. But think about it, these devices in our hands, they're practically magic wands. You wave your finger over the screen, and bam, you're video calling your best friend in another time zone or checking your bank balance in the middle of the park. And everyone just accepts it like, oh yeah, that's fine. That's normal. One of my favorite magic tricks we have now is how you can summon food to your doorstep. I open an app, pick out some pad thai or a burger, tap a button, and a little animated scooter icon appears on the screen to show me the real person making their way toward me with my food. I mean, I'm basically conjuring dinner out of thin air. And yet, I don't even think about it that way. Most of the time, I'm just mildly annoyed if it takes more than 20 minutes. But if you went back in time and told someone that in the future, we'd have this power to summon any meal we wanted with a few taps, they'd be flabbergasted. Or look at how we listen to music now. I can pull up practically any song I want from any time period and listen instantly. My record collection is basically infinite thanks to a streaming app. I don't have to wait for the radio to play it or dig through a pile of CDs. It's all right there at my fingertips, and I can listen to it whenever I want. I still remember buying a new CD, putting it in the player, and feeling that little thrill when the music started. Now we can skip around, build playlists, and customize the soundtrack to our lives every minute of every day. Then there's this strange new ability to live in a world where we're simultaneously connected to everyone and yet alone. I can know what my cousin had for dinner even though we live in different countries. She posts a picture, I click like, and it's like we've had a mini connection. We're all out here liking each other's moments, commenting with emojis, and even posting about our lives. And it feels oddly intimate, even though I haven't seen some of these people in years. It's like we've reinvented social interaction into this strange, new form where seeing a photo of your friend's cat feels almost like a conversation. The weirdest part is how this all affects memory. I don't even have to remember things myself anymore. If I want to relive a day from last year, I scroll back in my photo library, and there it all is: food I ate, places I went, friends I saw. We're capturing every little moment, storing them in our phones like external brains. And there's something surreal about that too, because now I find myself looking at photos just to remember what I did last weekend. It's like we're outsourcing parts of our own memories to these devices. And the wildest part? We trust them completely. We're like, yeah, phone, please store my memories and also my finances, my shopping list, and my friendships while you're at it. The other day, I found myself using a navigation app in my own city, which I thought I knew well. But it was rush hour and I wanted the fastest way home, so I pulled out my phone, plugged in my destination, and just followed the little blue line. Didn't even think about it. I started driving, following each turn, and the funny thing is I didn't even know where I was half the time. I just trusted that this magical app would get me home. I remember when getting lost was a real worry. Now I don't even consider it. If I don't know where I'm going, I pull out my phone and it just tells me. It's like my internal compass has been outsourced to Google. And honestly, I don't mind. And what about how we share things? People used to write letters that took days, even weeks, to arrive. Now I can send a message to a friend on the other side of the world, and they'll get it instantly. Sometimes I don't even need to send words. I'll send a photo, a meme, or even just a thumbs up emoji, and that's enough to say, "Hey, I'm here. I'm thinking of you." And I'll get a reply with the same speed. I've gotten so used to it that if it takes someone more than a couple of minutes to respond, I start thinking, where'd they go? Did I say something wrong? Meanwhile, back in the day, people would wait weeks to hear back and think nothing of it. Even the concept of home has shifted. For so many people, home isn't just a place they sleep and eat anymore. It's where they work, study, exercise, and relax. I have friends who now work fully remote, and their office is a corner of their bedroom. Their coworkers are just little squares on a screen. And they'll tell me they had a big meeting today, and I realize they're talking about something that happened over Zoom while they wore pajama bottoms. It's almost like we're living in these self-contained pods where the entire world gets funneled through a screen. Work, friendships, entertainment, shopping, it's all in one place now. And don't get me started on how we can practically see the future. The other day, I was checking the weather on my phone, looking at hour-by-hour updates to plan my day. My phone can predict when it's going to rain, almost to the minute, and I don't even think twice about it. Sometimes I'll even look at the air quality, pollen levels, UV index, all these invisible aspects of the day that my phone somehow knows. It's like having my own personal weather wizard at my service 24/7. Meanwhile, I still remember times when my family would try to guess the weather by just looking out the window and hoping for the best. And maybe the most curious part of all? None of this surprises us anymore. It's like we're all characters in a sci-fi movie who've forgotten to be shocked by the sci-fi. We're walking around with these powerful little tools that help us remember, navigate, connect, shop, and work, all while fitting in our pockets. And we just shrug like it's the most normal thing in the world. We don't even blink when new tech comes out. We just adopt it, adapt, and move on like it's totally expected. It's funny, isn't it? We're living in a world that our grandparents would have found magical. But here we are, worrying about deadlines, picking out Netflix shows, and scrolling through social media, too busy to notice how surreal it all actually is. We're in the middle of a quiet tech revolution, and our biggest concern is probably whether our phones are charged. It's all so familiar to us that we don't even stop to appreciate just how bizarrely amazing this everyday magic really is. So, here's what I'm wondering. What's one thing in your day-to-day life that feels a little bit magical, but that you've started to take completely for granted? It's late, probably close to midnight, and I'm sitting on my couch having this tiny moment of inner debate. My phone's in my hand, and I'm staring at a delivery app, wondering if I should really order a single slice of cheesecake. Just one. And there's this part of me that's trying to talk myself out of it, because it seems so ridiculous. Who pays for delivery on a single slice of cheesecake? But the other part of me? The other part is like, you've had a long week. Get the cheesecake. Life's short. So, there I am, feeling weirdly rebellious over this lone slice of dessert, like ordering it is some grand act of self-care. I tap place order, and I swear, I feel a little thrill. The cheesecake is on its way, and I barely lifted a finger. I lean back, scroll through social media while I wait, and it hits me. When did everything become so effortless? Like, when did I start treating delivery apps like a personal concierge for my random cravings? There's this whole quiet infrastructure making my life easier at every turn, and I don't even notice it most of the time. Think about it, so many parts of life are just automatic now, these little services that run in the background, subtly shaping our routines. My toothpaste is set to reorder itself when I'm running low. I get notifications that practically say, "Hey, you might be forgetting to be a functioning adult. Here's some toothpaste so you don't have to think about it." And weirdly, I love it. It's like life has been sprinkled with invisible fairy dust that keeps everything running smoothly. Even my morning routine has become this beautifully choreographed dance, thanks to a bunch of tiny conveniences that work so seamlessly, I don't even think about them. My alarm eases me awake with soft music. My coffee brews itself right on time. And my breakfast ingredients? They're already in the fridge because, yes, I subscribe to a meal kit delivery service. I mean, there's something almost luxurious about waking up and knowing my food is practically waiting for me, pre-portioned and ready to go. I'm not some five-star chef or anything, but it makes me feel like I could be. Just following the little recipe cards like I'm Gordon Ramsay in a much less intense universe. And then there's my phone, my tiny, ever-loyal companion that keeps me connected. At any given moment, I can scroll through everyone's daily highlights, friends, acquaintances, people I met once at a party. I can see what they're eating, where they're vacationing, what they're binge-watching. It's this continuous, low-level buzz of life updates that somehow makes me feel like I'm close to everyone without actually having to reach out. I'll watch my friend's new dog learn to sit, or see someone's adorable toddler try solid foods, and I feel like I'm right there with them. But we all know the truth. I'm just a passive observer. We're connected, but it's more like living in parallel than truly sharing experiences. And yet, it's comforting. I mean, I'm sitting here waiting for cheesecake, and somehow I'm also part of my friends' lives all at once. Speaking of friends, I realize that birthdays have become almost like digital drive-bys. I'll get a reminder from Facebook or my calendar app, a gentle nudge saying, "Hey, don't forget about Jen's birthday." And what do? I fire off a quick happy birthday with a cake emoji or maybe a little confetti gif if I'm feeling fancy. It's fast, it's easy, and somehow it counts. I'll see thank you and a few heart emojis in return, and that's that. Celebration complete. There's no card, no in-person gathering, just a 10-second message that says, "I remembered and I care," in a quick, modern way. And then, of course, there's the group chat, a place where time barely exists and conversations meander at their own pace. I could throw out a random thought at 3 p.m., and one friend might respond immediately, while another chimes in 6 hours later. There's no pressure, no urgency. We just let the conversation ebb and flow, adding bits and pieces as we go. The other day, I sent a meme that sparked this whole thread of inside jokes, and it felt like we were hanging out, even though none of us were actually together. It's this oddly cozy form of friendship, a way of staying in each other's lives without having to make a huge effort. I think about how much we rely on these conveniences, how they've shaped not just my daily routines, but even my relationships. My entertainment? I have an app that curates shows for me based on what I've already watched, as if it knows my taste better than I do. My playlists? Auto-generated, of course. I remember a time when making a playlist was this fun, painstaking process of picking out every song, crafting the perfect vibe. Now I just let an algorithm do the work. The music still sounds great, don't get me wrong, but sometimes I miss the days of CDs and mixtapes. There was something satisfying about curating those little pieces of life by hand. And then there's the scrolling. The endless, mindless scrolling that feels like a journey through a black hole of random knowledge. I'll start watching a video on how to organize a closet, and before I know it, I'm learning about underwater caves or the history of typewriters. It's like the internet has become this never-ending library of everything and nothing all at once, where you can get lost in the strangest corners without ever intending to. Sometimes, I'll look up and realize hours have passed, and I haven't even moved. It's the closest thing to time travel we have, and it's both awesome and a little terrifying. Yet, for all its quirks and distractions, there's something oddly comforting about this tech-woven life. I know it sounds strange, but these tiny conveniences make me feel like I'm cocooned in a soft digital blanket. My groceries arrive at my door. My friends are a meme away. My to-do list is managed by reminders that pop up without fail. It's like I'm living with a silent, invisible assistant that has everything under control, freeing me to just exist. And I get it. There's a downside. Maybe we're all a bit more detached, a bit less present. Maybe we're outsourcing too much. But in a world that's constantly demanding more of our time, more of our energy, I can't help but find some relief in the convenience of it all. I mean, there's something nice about knowing I can decide at midnight to order a slice of cheesecake, and it'll be here within minutes. Sure, it's silly, but it's also a small reminder that life doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes it can just be a cozy night, a delivered dessert, and a laugh at the absurdity of it all. And now I'm wondering, what's your little cheesecake moment? That one small indulgence, that quirky convenience that makes you pause and think, Wow, this is life now. So, here's how it started. I wake up on a normal Thursday morning, expecting the usual grogginess and a mild resentment toward my alarm clock. But as I rub my eyes and glance around, something feels off. I can't put my finger on it until I see my roommate, Jake, standing by the coffee maker. And he's glowing. Like, actually glowing with a shimmering silver aura that seems to pulse and shift as he makes his morning coffee. My brain scrambles to make sense of it, but before I can overthink it, a weird feeling pulls me toward him. "Jake," I ask, watching the silver light move like a liquid halo around him. He looks up, gives me a sleepy grin. "Morning." He doesn't seem to notice anything strange at all. And then suddenly I just know. It's hard to describe, but I get this clear, flashing sense that Jake can, somehow, pick any lock. Like without trying. The image is so specific. I can see him cracking open doors, safes, even ancient treasure chests, and he's just good at it. Now, this is news to me, since Jake's a quiet type who spends most of his free time reading sci-fi and wouldn't know what to do with a bobby pin, let alone a lock. So, I blurt out, "You know how to pick locks?" He laughs, looking confused. "What? No. Where did that come from?" But I can see it. It's like the talent is written in the glow surrounding him. And the weirder part? The longer I look, the more I feel like this is real. Like he's secretly a lock-picking genius and just doesn't know it. I brush it off and make my way to work, hoping the day will get less strange. Spoiler, it doesn't. At the office, I start seeing auras everywhere. My boss has this faint, gleaming blue glow around him that practically screams stand-up comedy. Which, by the way, is ridiculous because he's the least funny person I know. I mean, the guy's jokes can make a rock cringe. But there it is, clear as day. An aura that suggests he could crush it on a stage with a mic. I keep this talent-seeing ability to myself, not wanting to come off as completely unhinged. But as the day goes on, I start having a little fun with it. People pass me by in the halls, their talents practically announcing themselves like little whispers only I can hear. The shy intern who can bake elaborate wedding cakes, the IT guy with a knack for oil painting, the accountant who could probably solve a Rubik's Cube in 30 seconds flat. And these aren't talents they flaunt or are even aware of as far as I can tell. It's more like seeing hidden potential, the things people could do if they ever gave it a shot. I get curious, so I start testing it out. At lunch, I run into my friend Kim, who has a warm amber aura that radiates the word improviser like she's a jazz musician in another life. We're chatting, and I can't resist nudging her. "You ever try improv?" I ask casually, biting into my sandwich. She laughs, shaking her head. "Me? Oh, God no. I'd be terrible at it." But her aura shimmers, like it's almost daring her to try. And I can see a glint in her eye when she laughs. "Really? I bet you'd actually be pretty good," I say. She just shrugs, laughing it off, but I can't help imagining her standing on a stage, spinning wild stories and making people laugh. The vision is so clear. It's like I'm watching something that already happened. Over the next few days, I get hooked on my new skill, letting it lead me through a series of discoveries about everyone I know. At the gym, my personal trainer's aura pulses with a deep forest green that tells me he'd make a brilliant forest ranger. My neighbor, an older woman I pass by every day, has a flickering red aura that hints she's probably an amazing salsa dancer. And get this, my mail carrier, lavender aura, and for some reason, I'm positive she's got a gift for poetry. One day though, things take a twist. I'm grabbing my usual coffee when I see a young guy in the cafe corner, sipping his drink with a sketchbook in front of him. His aura is vibrant, a dazzling swirl of colors I haven't seen yet. I get this gut feeling that his talent is something incredible, but the aura is different this time, less clear, almost like it's obscured by static. Without thinking, I walk over and ask, "Hey, what's your thing? I mean, what are you good at?" He looks up surprised. Well, I'm trying to draw." He lifts his sketchbook to show me a rough outline of a character. But it's shaky, like he's just starting out. "That's great," I say, but in my head I know drawing isn't it. His aura shimmers, almost agitated, like it's trying to say, "No, that's not it." For the first time, I decide to take a risk and tell him. "I think you might be amazing at something else," I say. Not drawing, but maybe writing? Storytelling. His eyes go wide. How did you know that? I mean, I've always thought about writing, but I've never actually tried. The aura around him pulses with a warm, steady glow, as if satisfied. And I can feel the talent waiting, like a spark ready to ignite. Maybe you should give it a try, I say, and he nods slowly, like he's making a promise to himself. Leaving the cafe, I feel this weird kind of fulfillment, like I've said something right. It's like every person's talent is a hidden flame, waiting for someone to fan it into life, and now I can help do that. I start doing this more often, gently steering people toward the things I can see they're capable of. Each time, their auras pulse brighter, like they're waking up to their own potential. I even start a journal, noting down every talent I find, like a map of hidden possibilities. One day, I get curious and stand in front of a mirror, wondering what talent my aura would reveal. I stare at my reflection, waiting to see some glow, some hint of what I might be capable of that I don't even know yet. But nothing appears. No shimmer, no color, just my own reflection, staring back at me with a half smile, looking a little tired, a little uncertain. It's disappointing, but I tell myself it's okay. Maybe some people are just meant to help others find their talents. I head out, aura-less, but feeling surprisingly good about it. And that's when I run into Jake, who I'd pretty much forgotten about in my talent-seeing frenzy. "Hey," he says, smiling. And then he pauses, looking at me strangely. "Has anyone ever told you that you're good at finding things in people? Like, you're weirdly good at making people feel like they can do things they never thought they could." I feel a warm glow somewhere deep inside. Not something I can see, but something I can feel. A little spark that finally clicks into place. For us, it's our stargazing talks. It started as this random, spur-of-the-moment thing, but over time, it's turned into our most cherished ritual. Every so often, when the night is clear, we'll grab an old quilt, head outside, and lie down under the stars, talking about whatever comes to mind. It sounds simple, maybe even cliché, but for us, those nights are a way to reconnect, to slip into a slower rhythm and get lost in each other's company. It all started one summer night when we were both feeling restless. We'd been watching a movie, half distracted, neither of us really engaged. I think we both had long weeks and were in one of those moods where nothing quite felt right. Out of nowhere, my partner nudged me and said, "Come on, let's go outside." They grabbed a blanket and we wandered out to the backyard, plopping down in the grass. It was late and the neighborhood was quiet. Above us, the stars were scattered across the sky, so vivid it felt like you could reach up and touch them. We lay there in silence at first, just watching the sky. Then we started talking, slowly at first, and then with the kind of ease that only seems to happen when you're lying under the stars. We talked about our day, our childhood memories, our dreams. It was like we'd stepped into our own little world, separate from everything else. By the time we went back inside, I felt lighter, like I'd left a little bit of life's weight behind in the grass. After that, stargazing became our thing. Every once in a while, on those rare clear nights, we'd look at each other with that silent understanding and head outside with our old quilt in hand. It didn't matter what kind of day we'd had, or what was on our minds. Just lying there together, under the vast sky, was enough to make us feel close, connected. The stars somehow made everything we worried about seem smaller, like we were just two tiny people in a big, wide world, and that was okay. Some nights, we'd talk about silly things, making up stories about the stars above us, pretending to spot constellations that didn't exist. Once, we decided a random cluster of stars looked like our dog, who was snoozing in the grass beside us, and that became our lucky constellation. Every time we found it, we'd laugh and high-five, as if we discovered some rare treasure. Other nights, we'd get a little deeper. We'd talk about our future, our hopes, and even our fears. There's something about being under the stars that makes you feel brave, like you can say things you wouldn't otherwise. One night, during a particularly stressful time, I remember telling them about a big fear I'd been holding on to, something I hadn't even admitted to myself fully. They didn't say much, just squeezed my hand and looked over at me. And in that quiet moment, I felt understood in a way that words couldn't capture. One of my favorite memories happened one autumn night when the air was crisp and there was this chill that made us both wrap up in the quilt, holding each other close for warmth. We could see our breath in little clouds, and there was this perfect, peaceful quiet around us. Out of nowhere, my partner said, "Isn't it amazing how all these stars are light from years and years ago? It's like we're looking back in time." We sat there, letting that thought sink in, feeling like time itself had slowed down just for us. Over the years, our stargazing ritual has grown in meaning. It's like a reset button, a way for us to come back to each other, to remember who we are and why we're here, no matter what life throws at us. When we're stressed or feeling distant, a night under the stars brings us back to ourselves. We know that even if we're too tired to talk or if there's tension between us, just lying there side by side is enough to feel grounded again. There was one winter night that really stands out in my mind. It had been snowing all day, and the whole neighborhood was blanketed in white. We were both feeling a little down, cabin fever setting in, so we bundled up, grabbed the quilt, and went out to our backyard. Everything was still and quiet, the stars shining extra bright against the dark, snowy sky. We lay there, huddled together, and I felt this deep, simple happiness, like all was right in the world, even if just for that moment. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what love feels like. Over time, we made a little game of finding shooting stars. We'll each make a wish, and even though we never tell each other what it is, there's this shared excitement, this secret between us, as we lie there hoping for the universe to grant it. Some nights, we don't see any, but on the rare occasions we do, we'll squeeze each other's hand in silent joy, feeling like we've won some kind of cosmic lottery. Sometimes we even bring snacks, s'mores in the summer, hot cocoa in the winter. We'll lie there, snacking under the stars, feeling like kids at a slumber party. There's something freeing about it, about letting go of the day's stress and just enjoying each other's company, with no screens, no distractions, just the open sky above. Recently, we added a little twist to our ritual. We started bringing a notebook with us, taking turns writing down our thoughts as we lay there. It's not anything planned or organized. We just jot down whatever comes to mind. Sometimes it's silly, like tonight's star count, 3,827. Other times, it's more serious, like a note about something we're grateful for or a hope for the future. Over time, those little notes have added up, creating this beautiful record of our shared moments under the stars. Sometimes, we'll flip through the notebook together, laughing at our silly entries or getting misty-eyed at the more heartfelt ones. There's something incredibly comforting about this ritual. I know that, no matter what's happening in our lives, we'll always have our stargazing talks to come back to. It's like this little promise we've made to each other, a reminder that we're in this together, under the same big sky. It started with a doorbell I almost didn't answer. It was a Friday night, and I just settled in with a book and a cup of tea, ready to tune out the world for the weekend. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when the bell rang, I froze, debating whether to ignore it. But curiosity got the best of me, and I opened the door. Standing there was a girl, maybe 12 or 13, in a bright yellow raincoat and oversized rain boots. She looked up at me with a strange intensity, her brown eyes wide and unblinking. "Are you Kate?" she asked, like she already knew the answer. I nodded, trying to place her. "Do I know you?" She shook her head, then thrust out her hand, offering me a crumpled piece of paper. "I need you to come with me," she said, dead serious. "You're supposed to help me." My mind raced. "Help you with what?" She shrugged, as if that was a detail not worth mentioning. "Just come on. It's already started." Something in her voice was strangely compelling, like she was reading a script and my line was to say, "Yes, I'll go." I hesitated, then grabbed my coat, locked the door, and followed her down the steps, barely knowing what I was doing. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream you can't quite control. She led me down the street, moving at a brisk pace, her boots squelching in the damp autumn leaves. The night was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the whole world. As we walked, I tried to ask her questions. Her name, what this was all about, why she'd come to me of all people. But she just shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. After about 10 minutes, We turned down a narrow side street I'd never noticed before, despite having lived in this neighborhood for years. The houses here were old, with ivy crawling up the brick walls and curtains drawn tightly shut. Everything felt untouched by time, like this street had been left behind by the rest of the world. Finally, she stopped in front of a house with a single light flickering on the porch. The number above the door read 1167, but it looked hand-painted, the kind you'd expect on an old, forgotten inn in a fairy tale. The girl gestured for me to follow her up the steps, then reached out and knocked in a distinct, rhythmic pattern, 3 quick knocks, too slow. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit entryway filled with stacks of newspapers, old magazines, and dusty books. It smelled like cinnamon and something vaguely metallic, and there was a faint hum, like a radio turned down low. "Welcome, Kate," said a voice from within. An elderly woman appeared, leaning on a cane, her long, silver hair falling in thick waves over her shoulders. She wore a dark green dress and a scarf that looked like it had been made from scraps of fabric, each piece a different color. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my heart pounding. She smiled, her gaze soft but penetrating. "Oh, I know many things," she said. "But tonight, you're here because there's something you need to see." The girl in the yellow raincoat slipped past her and disappeared down a hallway, leaving me alone with the woman, who beckoned for me to follow her into a small sitting room. The walls were covered in framed photographs, each one black and white, showing people from different eras. There was a man in a top hat, a woman in a flapper dress, a little boy holding a model airplane, and dozens of other faces, all looking out as if they had something important to say. The woman pointed to a photograph on the far wall. It was slightly crooked, showing a young woman with short, dark hair and a soft smile. I took a step closer, squinting at it, and felt a chill run down my spine. She looked exactly like my grandmother when she was young. That's impossible," I stammered, looking back at the woman, who was watching me intently. "Not impossible, just forgotten," she replied, her voice low and soothing. "Sometimes things are left behind, waiting to be remembered. Tonight, it's time to remember yours." The girl in the yellow raincoat returned, carrying a small, ornate box with a delicate lock on the front. She held it out to me, her face serious. "It's yours," she said. "You just need to open it." I took the box from her, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the weight of it, as if it held something significant. My fingers traced the lock, and I noticed an inscription carved just below it. "For what's been lost." Without thinking, I twisted the lock, and it popped open with a soft click. Inside was a small, folded piece of fabric, a handkerchief with a delicate embroidered pattern, the initials GS stitched in one corner. My grandmother's initials. I remembered seeing it once as a child, the day I'd rummaged through her dresser looking for treasures. She had always said it was her lucky handkerchief, but I'd never known why. The elderly woman watched me, her eyes filled with understanding. "Your grandmother left it here years ago," she said quietly, along with her memory of that night. I looked at her confused. "What night?" "She was here, just like you, following something she couldn't explain. She left this here for the next one who needed it, the one who would understand." I unfolded the handkerchief and felt something drop into my hand. A tiny silver ring with a single star engraved on the band. The image jolted something loose in my memory, and suddenly I was a little girl again, sitting on my grandmother's lap as she told me a story about the Ring of the Stars. She'd always been full of magical tales, stories of places she claimed to have been, dreams she'd turned into legends. I thought she'd made them up, but holding the ring now, it felt like she was telling me something I'd only half heard all those years ago. What does this mean?" I whispered, looking at the woman and the girl. The woman tilted her head, smiling. "That's for you to discover. Your grandmother left you a legacy, a mystery she couldn't solve in her time. But perhaps you're ready for it now." I slipped the ring onto my finger and immediately felt a strange warmth spread through my hand. It felt like holding my grandmother's hand again, her gentle touch, her soft voice, telling me I'd understand someday. The warmth was comforting, filling me with a strange sense of purpose, as if a piece of her was alive in me, ready to be rekindled. The girl in the raincoat reached out, taking my hand. "It's time to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at the elderly woman, who nodded with quiet encouragement. As the girl led me back down the hallway, I felt a deep peace settle over me, an unexplainable certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When we reached the door, I turned to thank the woman, but the door had already closed, and the house stood dark and silent as though no one had ever been there at all. Back home, I slipped the ring into my own drawer next to the photo of my grandmother. It felt like I was reconnecting with a part of my family, a part of myself I hadn't even known was missing. Every so often, I'll catch the glint of that little silver star in the ring, and it fills me with a quiet sense of wonder, a reminder of the mysteries that are always just around the corner. Have you ever found something that seemed to hold a piece of your own story? Or stumbled upon a place that felt like it was just waiting for you? Today started out like any other day, or so I thought. I was brushing my teeth, looking in the mirror, when it happened. My reflection cleared its throat. Not in an "I've got something stuck" way, but in the "okay, we need to talk" way. "Listen," it said, crossing its arms, mimicking a look I've given myself in self-motivational pep talks. "It's been a while since you tried something new. Just thought you should know." I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, blinking at my own face as it looked back at me with a pointed stare, like a best friend who's tired of your excuses. "Don't give me that look," it said, mirroring my raised eyebrows. "You know I'm right." Stunned and slightly embarrassed in front of myself, I mumbled, "Okay, fine. I'll try something new." My reflection nodded approvingly and faded back into its usual, non-judgmental self, but not without a final, satisfied smirk. I put my toothbrush down, realizing I'd just been guilt-tripped by my own reflection. And that was only the start. Out in the kitchen, I picked up my phone to check the weather. Instead of the forecast, a single sentence popped up on my screen. "Today might surprise you." I stared at it, half expecting it to wink at me, but the screen stayed blank, as if my phone had delivered its cryptic message and gone back to its usual business. Still, I shrugged and decided to make my morning coffee. Nothing could go too wrong with coffee, right? As I reached for the coffee jar, the toaster popped up a piece of toast I hadn't even put in. I stared at it, genuinely baffled. And right there on the slightly brown surface were the words, "Try something different today." I could have sworn the toaster smiled. Deciding to embrace the strangeness, I took the toast and headed out for a walk. Maybe my reflection, phone, and toaster knew something I didn't. The moment I stepped outside, it became clear that the world was indeed operating on a different level of honesty. A bird perched on a nearby branch, and as I looked up, it tilted its head and squawked, "You should really call your mom." I blinked, then nodded, embarrassed at being called out by a sparrow, of all things. "Yeah, okay," I muttered, taking out my phone to make a reminder. The street was full of similar moments. A breeze blew past, and it carried the faintest whisper, "That shirt's been in rotation a lot." I rolled my eyes, muttering something about judgmental wind as I tightened my jacket. Even the crosswalk sign got in on it. Instead of the usual walk, it flashed, "Breathe. You rush too much." I slowed down, realizing that maybe I did rush through my days without noticing the little things. And apparently today, everything had decided to hold me accountable. At the park, I took a seat on my usual bench, only to find a note taped under the armrest. "Your friends miss you. Text someone you haven't seen in a while." It read in a loopy, handwritten script. I glanced around, wondering if someone was watching, but the park was as empty as ever. Sighing, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick "Hey, how's it going?" to a friend I hadn't seen in months. Within seconds, she replied, "Wow, I was just thinking of you." I had to admit this strange, brutally honest world was onto something. As I walked further into the city, everything I passed seemed determined to offer advice or observations I hadn't asked for. A lamppost suggested I try journaling. "It's not as cheesy as you think." While a bench suggested that I try new music. "Give jazz a shot. You'll like it." Even the bus stop poster chimed in, flashing an ad that read, "Stop stressing about things you can't control. Free trial today." Waiting for the bus, I leaned against a trash can, only to hear a soft, rumbling voice say, "Thanks for actually throwing stuff away. Most people don't." I couldn't help but smile, patting the lid in response. "You're welcome," I replied, feeling absurdly proud to be complimented by a trash can. The bus itself seemed to have opinions too. As I took my seat, the window beside me fogged up slightly, forming the words, "When was the last time you did something just for fun?" I stared at it, realizing I had no good answer. Work, bills, chores, it all felt so endless, but when had I actually just done something for the pure joy of it? The question lingered in my mind, settling there like a small pebble I couldn't ignore. At my stop, I hopped off the bus and wandered into a coffee shop I'd never noticed before. Inside, the barista seemed to be expecting me. "You look like you need to pick me up," she said with a wink, handing me a warm cup before I'd even ordered. "What is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "A little something to remind you that life's supposed to be sweet." She gave me a grin, and I took a sip, discovering the drink was filled with rich chocolate and a hint of cinnamon. It tasted like a warm hug, and I couldn't help but smile back, feeling a bit lighter. Outside, I took my time walking home, feeling the strange openness of the world seep into my own mind. It was as if everything I'd passed had given me permission to just be honest, with myself, with what I wanted, with the things I was afraid to admit. When I reached my door, my reflection caught my eye in the window, nodding approvingly. "Well," it seemed to ask, "learn anything?" I chuckled, shaking my head. Yeah, I muttered back. "I get it." Inside, everything was quiet again, the world back to its usual self. But as I kicked off my shoes, I noticed a sticky note on my fridge that hadn't been there before. Written in the same loopy handwriting, it read, "Remember, tomorrow's another chance." I peeled it off, smiling as I stuck it on my calendar. Maybe I'd hold myself accountable a little more often. Or maybe I'd let the world do it for me just once in a while. So, if the world around you could suddenly be honest for a day, what truths do you think it would reveal? Alright, imagine this. I'm on my couch, feet up, watching the little light on my smart speaker blink as I ask it for the third time this week. "What's the weather like tomorrow?" I don't know why I keep asking. I'm working from home, and honestly, I haven't left my apartment in 2 days. But there's something about hearing that soft, automated voice tell me it'll be 68 and sunny that makes me feel connected, like it's a tiny ritual grounding me in the outside world, even though I'm not part of it. And it's funny because I remember a time when checking the weather meant actually stepping outside and looking up at the sky. But now, I get detailed forecasts every morning from a virtual assistant that doesn't just tell me the weather. It practically plans my day. It'll remind me of meetings, tell me to bring an umbrella, even suggest a recipe for dinner based on what's left in my fridge. It's like having a little AI sidekick, always there, always listening, giving me updates on a world that sometimes feels a bit removed from my apartment life. The best part? I don't even question it anymore. This weird companionship with my smart speaker has become just normal. That's when it hits me. My whole life is wrapped up in these small, convenient interactions that I never even pause to consider. Like my grocery shopping routine, it's practically an automated process at this point. Every Sunday, I get a notification, a little "Hey, you're low on milk and eggs" nudge, as if my fridge has developed its own memory. A few taps later, I've got my usual order on the way, delivered within the hour, and I don't even have to look at the list. My grocery app has memorized my staples so well that it feels like it knows my taste better than I do. I've even found myself saying, "Oh, right, I do need yogurt," as if the app somehow knew my needs before I did. And it's not just the groceries. My whole daily routine is woven with these little, invisible threads of automation. My coffee maker kicks on at precisely 7 a.m., synced to my alarm, so I wake up to that perfect smell drifting through the apartment. I'll shuffle to the kitchen in a daze, still half asleep, and my phone's already lit up with a news summary and a playlist ready to go. It's like my morning is pre-packaged, complete with headlines and a soundtrack. I mean, sure, it's convenient, but when did I start letting my devices choreograph my day before I even get out of bed? Then, of course, there's the whole phenomenon of communicating through apps. My friends and I, we barely text anymore. We've moved on to voice memos, those 30-second sound bites where we update each other between errands, meetings, or whatever random thing is happening. There's something strange and hilarious about it. I'll be doing dishes and listen to a friend rambling about her latest dating disaster. And then, hands still wet, I'll record my response, barely pausing to dry off. It's like our conversations have turned into this patchwork of short audio bursts stitched together by the rhythm of our busy lives. Somehow, it feels like we're talking all the time, even though we're really just leaving voice messages in each other's inboxes. And the weird thing is, these little bursts of sound have become enough. My friendships exist in this mosaic of voice memos, memes, and reaction GIFs, and somehow, I feel closer to people than I would through long, sit-down conversations. There's something real in those little snippets of laughter and, oh my god, guess what happened, that pop up throughout my day like we're all right there with each other, even if we're scattered across cities or countries. Then there's how I stay in the loop with what everyone else is doing. I'll get notifications when someone posts a story, and in a few taps, I'm on a virtual tour of their latest hiking trip, new apartment, or weekend brunch. It's like being a fly on the wall of everyone's lives, and there's something oddly satisfying about it. I'll see a friend's dog chasing a ball at the park, or someone's attempt at a fancy homemade pizza, and it's like I'm there, without actually being there. And I know, it's a bit strange, like we're all broadcasting these tiny highlights of our lives to an invisible audience, but it's also oddly comforting. I might be home alone, but I don't feel isolated. There's a whole world of little life moments right there on my screen, always ready to fill in the quiet. And then, of course, there are birthdays. Birthdays used to mean getting together, maybe buying a card or even throwing a party. Now they're digital notifications, a gentle reminder to type a quick happy birthday on someone's wall or send a balloon emoji in a group chat. It's funny. Half the time, I barely remember how old anyone is, but the emoji feels like it's enough. It's like we're all collectively saying, hey, I thought of you today, and that's just become the standard. Somehow it works. No grand gestures, just a quick tap and a birthday cake sticker, and we're all satisfied. Even my entertainment has turned into this constant, curated stream. I'll get notifications suggesting shows to watch, playlists to check out, or articles to read, based entirely on what I've already liked. It's as if the algorithm knows me so well. It's lining up content before I even know I'm interested. The weirdest part? I'll actually follow its suggestions. I'll dive into a show I'd never heard of because my app thought I might enjoy it, and more often than not, it's spot on. I remember when finding a new movie meant flipping through cable channels or browsing DVD aisles. Now, everything I could ever want is lined up in a queue, waiting for me. It's amazing, but also a little eerie, like I'm not even the one picking my entertainment anymore. And yet, I can't deny how much I love it, how these small conveniences have become a kind of scaffolding for my day. There's something reassuring in knowing my groceries will just show up, my coffee will be ready, and my friends are only a voice memo away. I know it sounds funny, but these tiny, automated touches make me feel taken care of in a way. It's like I've set up a mini support system woven into my daily life, so I never have to feel too overwhelmed or alone. Of course, I get that there's a downside. Maybe I'm more dependent on technology, a bit less spontaneous. Maybe I'm losing touch with the real world, just a little. But I think about how easy everything is, how these little conveniences let me focus on what I actually want to do, and honestly, I wouldn't trade it. So, here I am, curled up on my couch, waiting for the food delivery I ordered without moving a muscle, marveling at this strange new way of living. It's weird, it's wonderful, and it's funny how quickly it's become normal. I mean, who would have thought that I'd reach a point where even my friendships, my routines, and my birthday wishes are all carefully optimized, trimmed down to fit the speed of modern life? And it makes me curious. What's one small, quirky thing that technology does for you? Something you'd miss if it just disappeared? It all began with a dull Thursday night shift at the gas station. Nothing ever happened during those hours. It was just me, a bunch of flickering neon lights, and the occasional car stopping by for a fill-up. I was working the register, zoning out to the hum of the fridges when an old, beat-up camper van pulled into the lot. The thing looked like it had traveled halfway around the world and was held together by duct tape and hope. Out of the driver's seat popped this older woman, wrapped in layers of scarves and wearing the brightest orange hat I'd ever seen. She looked around like she'd expected someone to meet her, then zeroed in on me through the glass doors. I straightened up, watching as she strolled in with a smile that was a little too wide for midnight at a gas station. "Evening," she said, her voice cheerful and loud. "Just the person I was hoping to find." I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to be amused or alarmed. "You're looking for me?" "Oh, definitely," she replied with a wink. "You're a night owl, aren't you?" I hesitated, wondering how she could possibly know that. But before I could ask, she placed a little folded piece of paper on the counter between us. "Take this," she said, nodding at the paper. "It's an invitation, but only if you're up for a little adventure." The absurdity of the situation made me laugh. "An invitation to what?" "An adventure, like I said," she replied, grinning as if she were letting me in on the punchline of some cosmic joke. "There's a warehouse not far from here. Go to the corner of 4th and Pine, take the alley around back, and knock on the blue door. That's where the fun begins. It's a one-night-only kind of deal." I looked down at the paper she'd left. It was handwritten, the letters in looping cursive. It read, "Midnight Rendezvous, for those who seek what they cannot find." Beneath it was a little drawing of a compass with an arrow pointing west. I didn't know what to say. This woman had come out of nowhere, dropped a mysterious invitation, and now she was just leaving. As she walked back to her camper van, she called over her shoulder, "See you there, if you're brave enough." I sat there, staring at the invitation, thinking about how ridiculous it all was. But something tugged at me. Maybe it was boredom or curiosity, or maybe it was just the way she looked at me like she knew something I didn't. After about 10 minutes of debating, I grabbed my coat, locked the store, and set off toward the address on the invitation. When I arrived, I found the warehouse exactly as she described, looming in the shadows with a single, dull light flickering above the blue door. I knocked, half expecting no one to answer, and almost turned to leave when the door creaked open. Inside was nothing like I'd imagined. The warehouse was transformed into a labyrinth of rooms, each space lit with soft, colorful lights and filled with oddities that felt like they'd been collected from 100 different lifetimes. There was a room filled with clocks, each one ticking slightly out of sync. Another room had walls covered in maps, ancient ones with faded markings, modern ones with mysterious red circles drawn in random places. I wandered, fascinated and slightly disoriented, until I found myself in a room with a makeshift bar. People were lounging on mismatched couches, sipping drinks that seemed to glow under the dim light. They all looked as though they'd come from completely different worlds. An older gentleman in a tuxedo, a young woman in a sari, a man wearing a tattered leather jacket and thick, round glasses. Everyone was talking in hushed voices, and the whole place had an air of quiet excitement, like everyone was waiting for something. I sat at the bar, feeling completely out of place. The bartender, a tall, thin guy with a handlebar mustache and tattoos up his arms, leaned over, sizing me up with a grin. "First time?" he asked, sliding me a drink in a small crystal glass. Yeah, I admitted, still taking it all in. "I don't even know what this is." He chuckled. "That's the point. Welcome to the Midnight Rendezvous. We're a bit of a tradition, you see, something between a club and a gathering for wanderers. People who are searching for something. Most don't even know what it is. But everyone here has one thing in common." "What's that?" "They're all here because they said yes to the unknown." The word sent a thrill through me. I sipped my drink, and it was sweet and strong, with a taste I couldn't quite place. As I watched, people began to drift into other rooms, talking in small groups, examining the strange objects scattered around, as if they were looking for something hidden. There was a girl in a blue dress carrying a crystal ball, a man with a telescope he set up in a corner, aiming it at an old window as if he could see through the walls. It was as if every person there had brought a piece of their world to share with everyone else. I started to move around, drawn by the murmurs and the soft hum of music coming from somewhere deeper in the maze. Eventually, I found myself in a room filled with mirrors. Each one was different, some cracked, some polished, some covered in dust. But what was strangest of all was that each reflection showed me something slightly off. In one mirror, I looked older, my face lined with laugh lines and my hair streaked with gray. In another, I looked like I'd just come from some fancy event, dressed in a suit that was both completely alien and oddly familiar. Each mirror seemed to show a different version of me, as if every choice I'd ever made had created another self. and they were all here, waiting. "See anything you like?" A voice asked behind me. I turned to find the woman from the gas station, smiling knowingly. "Well, what is this place?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "It's whatever you need it to be," she replied simply. "Some people find themselves here when they're at a crossroads. Others just stumble in by accident, looking for a drink or a story. But everyone leaves with something." She gestured to a small, ornate mirror tucked in the corner. It was slightly cracked, but there was something compelling about it. I walked over, drawn to my reflection. In this one, I looked just like myself, but there was a spark in my eyes that felt new, like I'd just been let in on a secret. "Go ahead," she said, handing me a small piece of chalk. "Write down what you're looking for. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone but you." I took the chalk, hesitating for a moment, then scribbled a single word on the glass: freedom. It was a word that had been lurking in the back of my mind for a long time, but until that moment, I hadn't realized just how much it mattered to me. The woman gave me a satisfied nod. "Remember that word. Keep it with you. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and melted into the crowd, leaving me standing in front of the mirror with the chalk dust still on my fingers. When I left the midnight rendezvous, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft glow over the empty streets. I felt different, lighter somehow, like I'd left behind some invisible weight. And as I walked home, I kept thinking about that word on the mirror, freedom, wondering if maybe, just maybe, I'd taken the first step toward finding it. Since that night, I've noticed little changes. I started saying yes to things I would have ignored before. I found myself taking different routes, exploring new places, meeting new people. It was like that night opened a door inside me, one I didn't know was there. So, I'll ask you, have you ever followed a strange path, not knowing where it would lead, only to find exactly what you needed? It started on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable day that doesn't usually promise anything unusual. I was taking my usual lunch break stroll, wandering the side streets to escape the relentless grayness of work and concrete. That's when I noticed a narrow alleyway I'd somehow never seen before. There was no sign, no markings, just a dim passageway tucked between two ancient brick buildings. It looked like the kind of place that might swallow you up and spit you back out somewhere new. So naturally, I couldn't resist. Halfway down, I saw the first flash of color, a small mosaic of red and yellow tiles embedded in the wall, forming an arrow pointing ahead. Intrigued, I followed it, passing more mosaics. A sun, a crescent moon, a scattering of stars. The alley twisted and narrowed, the sounds of the city fading, replaced by a faint, haunting melody. By the time I reached the end, I'd crossed some invisible line into a pocket of silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. There, at the end of the alley, was a small door painted in swirling shades of purple, with an old-fashioned brass knocker shaped like a dragon's head. Above it, a faded wooden sign read, "The Curious Room." I didn't think twice, I knocked. The door swung open slowly, and I stepped into a dim, candlelit room filled with an eclectic mix of, well, everything. It was part curiosity shop, part museum, part library, and completely unlike any place I'd ever been. Shelves overflowed with strange objects. Tables were scattered with vials and compasses, and walls were covered in paintings, maps, and faded photographs. The air smelled faintly of lavender, mixed with something metallic and old, like a place that had lived through countless lifetimes. At the center of the room was an elderly woman with silver hair tied in a braid, her glasses perched at the edge of her nose. She looked up as I entered, her expression both surprised and delighted, as if she hadn't had a visitor in ages. "Welcome," she said in a voice that was both warm and sharp, like an invitation and a challenge wrapped in one. It's not every day someone finds their way to the Curious Room. "I'm Isma. Isma. I'm just wandering." I managed, feeling oddly self-conscious. I didn't even know this place existed. "Few do," she said with a smile that held secrets. "But no one arrives here by accident. Everyone who walks through that door comes searching for something, whether they know it or not." I wanted to laugh, but something about her words kept me quiet. I looked around, feeling that strange pull, that sense of familiarity and wonder. She gestured toward a small armchair by the fireplace and motioned for me to sit. Then she handed me a delicate cup of tea in a chipped, painted cup that looked like it belonged to some lost century. "You're welcome to look around," she said, her eyes twinkling over the rim of her own cup. "But know that everything in this room has a story, and each one leaves a mark." I wandered around the shop, sipping the tea, which tasted faintly of honey and herbs. Each shelf was a treasure trove of the unexpected. I picked up a small compass with a cracked glass face, and as I held it, a warm wave of calm washed over me. For a moment, I felt like I was back at my grandparents' lake cabin, standing at the edge of the water, feeling like anything was possible. I set it down, shaken but fascinated. Then there was a wooden music box, carved with intricate details. When I wound it up, it played a haunting melody that made the room feel heavy, almost like the air itself remembered something sorrowful and beautiful. A pair of old leather gloves felt warm, as if someone had just taken them off. There was an old map of a place that didn't exist anymore, or maybe hadn't existed yet. "Everything here holds a piece of its history," Esme said, watching me with a soft smile. "Sometimes, that history brushes off on whoever touches it." I spent hours exploring. She'd come by occasionally, sharing little stories or hints. She told me about a lantern that once guided lost sailors, an old camera that took pictures of things that weren't there, a small glass bottle filled with water that shimmered like it held a sky inside. Each item felt as if it could open up a whole new world. Eventually, I found myself standing before a shelf at the back of the room, where a small notebook lay, bound in faded red leather. There was no title, just an intricate pattern etched into the cover, a swirl of lines that seemed to shift as I looked at it. "Ah, that one's special," Esme said, appearing at my side. "It's the Book of Whispers." I opened it carefully, half expecting the pages to crumble, but they were thick, textured, with faint writing scribbled in a mix of different handwriting styles. The words were fragments, scattered memories, tiny glimpses into lives I could only imagine. "There's a place, just outside of town, where the fireflies gather in hundreds on summer nights." I heard her laughter echo in the hall, even years after she left. I dreamed of a forest that went on forever, the trees whispering my name. Each line was like a puzzle piece, fragments of memories that didn't quite fit together, but somehow made sense all the same. And with each line I read, I felt a strange, quiet joy, like I was glimpsing pieces of the world I'd always felt were hidden just out of reach. As I stood there, Esme touched my arm gently. "You can take that with you," she said softly, "but know that it will add to itself with pieces of your own story. When you're ready, you'll bring it back, just like the others did." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of responsibility mixed with gratitude. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I'd be back. As I left the shop, the book tucked carefully under my arm, I glanced back to wave, but the doorway was empty. I looked up and down the alley, but the painted door and the brass dragon knocker were gone. The wall was blank, just plain brick and mortar like it had always been. For weeks afterward, I found myself writing in the notebook, capturing thoughts and moments that felt like they belonged to something larger. Every now and then, when I least expected it, I'd catch a whiff of that same floral scent like an invitation. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I could hear the faintest sound of a music box melody drifting through the air. Now, whenever I pass an unmarked alley or a narrow path I've never seen before, I feel a thrill, a sense of possibility. Part of me is always searching, hoping that one day I'll stumble across that little shop again, to add my own whispers to the shelves and discover what new mysteries it holds. Have you ever found a place, unexpected and strange, that felt like it was waiting just for you, a place that left you changed? A few years ago, I was on a work trip in a city I'd never been to before. It was one of those short-notice, back-to-back meetings kind of trips, and I was fully prepared to be exhausted by the time I got back home. But then, as I was heading back to my hotel one evening, I noticed this little handwritten sign on the sidewalk that said, "Free entry, jazz jam, upstairs." I hesitated. Going to a jazz club alone felt a little cinematic, but I figured, why not? I was in a strange city, no one knew me, and I didn't have to be work professional until the next morning. The club was this tiny, dimly lit room with mismatched chairs and a low ceiling. There were maybe 20 people in the whole place, mostly locals and a few people who looked like regulars. A group of musicians were setting up on a small stage in the corner, chatting and laughing like they'd known each other forever. I ordered a drink, settled into a corner chair, and just let myself relax for the first time in weeks. The first notes hit, and it was like the whole room took a collective breath. The sax player was this guy in his 70s with long, wild hair, looking like he'd stepped out of a different era. He closed his eyes, started playing, and I was gone. The music was raw, and it filled the room like a living thing. I felt myself getting pulled in, like I'd somehow stumbled into the beating heart of this city without meaning to. Then, about halfway through the set, the sax player paused, scanned the room, and said, "All right, we need one more up here. Who's feeling brave?" I looked around, expecting someone to stand up, but no one did. So he shrugged and said, "How about you, stranger in the back?" At first, I laughed, looking behind me to see if he was talking to someone else. But everyone was staring right at me. I'd never played an instrument in my life, had no musical talent whatsoever. But there was this weird energy in the room, this kind of unspoken challenge. I stood up, grinning and embarrassed, and made my way to the stage. He handed me a tambourine, gave me a wink, and said, "Just feel it." And I did. I stood there, in front of a bunch of strangers in a city where I didn't know a soul, shaking a tambourine like it was the most natural thing in the world. I wasn't good, not even close, but it didn't matter. The whole room was cheering me on, laughing, clapping in time like we were all in on some big, beautiful joke together. For a few minutes, I wasn't just a stranger passing through. I was part of the music, part of the room. It felt wild and ridiculous, but I didn't care. After the song ended, the sax player patted me on the back, gave me a knowing nod, and said, "You got rhythm, kid." I'd probably been completely offbeat, but the way he said it, I felt like I'd just gotten inducted into some secret society. When I went back to my seat, a woman sitting nearby leaned over and said, "This your first time here?" I nodded, still a little dazed, and she told me about how this place had been around for decades, a gathering spot for locals and artists and anyone else who just needed a break from the world. She said people often stumbled in and ended up staying the whole night. It had a pull, she said, like a heartbeat in the middle of the city that people just knew to find. We kept talking, and before I knew it, I was hearing her life story. She'd been a regular there for years, had her share of wild nights and heartbreaks, and swore she'd never leave the city as long as this place was around. There was something grounding about listening to her talk, like I'd known her far longer than an hour. It's funny how music, strangers, and the right amount of dim lighting can make you feel like you're exactly where you need to be. The musicians played until well past midnight, and people would drift on and off the stage, joining in with whatever instrument they had, some just snapping fingers or clapping along. Everyone in that little room had left whatever was outside the door, and we were just there. It was like we all understood that the night was something rare, something you don't try to recreate. When I finally left, the sax player waved, gave me a salute, and called out, "See you next time, tambourine." I laughed, nodded, and stepped out onto the empty street. The city was quiet, and the neon lights reflected off the wet pavement. The whole world felt soft and electric at the same time. As I walked back to the hotel, I felt like I'd taken a piece of that night with me, something real and alive that couldn't be described. It was as if that random, unexpected night had breathed something back into me I didn't even know I'd lost. Sometimes when I'm having a rough day, I think about that little club. I think about the sax player, that tambourine, and all those strangers who cheered me on like we were old friends. I don't know if I'll ever find that place again, but it's okay. That night is etched into my mind, and it's one of those memories that reminds me that life can still surprise you in the best ways, just when you least expect it. Anyone else ever wander into a place where they felt like they were meant to be, even for just one night? Alright, here's my strange little dating quirk that I'm low-key embarrassed to admit. Every time I develop a crush on someone, I end up making this super secret list about them in my head, like I'm compiling a private dossier of their likes, habits, weird quirks, and other random details. And yes, I do keep it all in a notebook. Don't judge me. It started back in high school, when I had my first real crush on a guy named Nick. Nick sat 2 rows in front of me in history class, and every time he answered a question, he'd twirl his pen between his fingers and then flick it against his notebook like a mini drum roll. I was fascinated by this little move, so I wrote it down in the margin of my own notes with the heading, Nick Details. What started as a tiny observation turned into a whole secret page dedicated to Nick's traits, like his favorite snack, sour gummy worms, the songs he would hum, which I'd Shazam to figure out, and even what brand of sneakers he wore, Vans always. It was like my own little detective project, and I'd keep track of new discoveries every time I saw him. Did I ever work up the courage to talk to him? No. But by the end of the year, I could practically write his biography. As I got older, the list habit kind of stuck, evolving from little scraps of paper to full-on digital notes in my phone. When I have a crush on someone, I'm instantly in detective mode, noticing every random detail. For example, when I was into this girl named Emma, I discovered she always ordered extra hot sauce on her burrito, had a habit of flipping through books backwards, still no idea why, and would wear her hair in a low bun every Tuesday without fail. It became this weird, almost ritualistic note-taking, and I found myself scrolling through my Emma list whenever I wanted a little dopamine hit. Just knowing these small things about her felt like a secret treasure. The funny part is, these lists have absolutely zero use in real life. I'm not collecting evidence for some grand confession or planning some perfect moment to reveal all this research. Half of the time, I never actually talk to the person I'm crushing on, so the lists just sit there growing full of these tiny details that only I know. It's like keeping an archive of unrequited crushes, my own personal museum of missed connections. Some people collect baseball cards. I collect random details about people I'm too shy to actually ask out. One time, I made the mistake of accidentally sharing one of these lists. I had a crush on a guy in my friend group named Alex, and I've been keeping tabs on him for months, noting things like only eats pineapple pizza, weird I know, loves to skateboard after work, and has a tattoo on his wrist that he hides under his watch. I don't even know why I'd started doing it. It just made me feel like I was learning something intimate about him, even if he had no idea. But one night, we were at a group dinner, and someone joked about how mysterious Alex was. Without thinking, I started rattling off all these random facts I'd picked up, like how he never drinks soda, even if it's the only thing in the fridge, or how he always taps his foot to whatever song is playing in the background. I thought everyone would laugh and move on, but Alex just looked at me, completely bewildered, and asked, "How do you know all that?" It was a very deer in headlights moment for me. I froze, realizing that I'd just unintentionally revealed my habit. I mumbled something lame about just noticing things, which only made everyone more curious. I was mortified. Thankfully, Alex was a good sport about it, and it actually sparked a closer friendship between us. But ever since that night, he'd occasionally drop random facts about me in conversations, like he was compiling his own list on me as a joke. The whole thing left me both blushing and flustered, which probably made him even more curious. The thing is, I've realized these lists have become a sort of way for me to get closer to people without having to, actually get close. It's like I'm forming a quiet, invisible connection with them, even if it's all in my head. When I write down something like, he only smiles with his eyes when he's around his friends, or she always adds cinnamon to her coffee, it makes the person feel real to me, like we've shared something meaningful, even if they're completely unaware. It's not just about collecting facts, though. There's this weird sense of romance in it, like the lists capture the fleeting beauty of noticing someone in a way that no one else does. There was one girl, Leah, who always wore these quirky rings that she'd fiddle with when she was nervous, twisting them around her fingers as she listened. I'd never seen anyone else notice that about her, but it felt like this delicate, magical detail that only I was privy to. And whenever I'd see her doing it, my heart would flutter a little. I kept that Leah list for months, never doing anything with it, just quietly admiring these small things that made her, her. Some of my friends have asked me why I don't just talk to my crushes instead of going full Nancy Drew on them, but I guess I find comfort in the secrecy of it. Talking to someone means they'll know, and if they know, then I'm vulnerable. But making a list? That's safe. That's just me and my thoughts and this quiet fascination that no one else has to see. It's like I get to admire the person without the risk of rejection. Plus, it's honestly fun in a strange way, like I'm building this secret portfolio of everything that makes them who they are, even if they never see it. The downside, of course, is that these lists make me feel way more invested in my crushes than I should be. I had a crush on a guy named James who always hummed when he was concentrating. I wrote it down in my James list and let myself imagine him doing that in various scenarios: cooking dinner, studying, even fixing his bike. Soon, the list had grown so long that I almost felt like I'd built an entire relationship with him in my head. When he mentioned he was seeing someone, I felt this weird pang of jealousy, even though we'd never spoken more than a few words to each other. Sometimes I look back at my lists and wonder what I was thinking. I'll see notes like, wore yellow 3 times this week, maybe his favorite color, and laugh at how invested I was in these tiny, irrelevant details. But even then, I can't bring myself to delete them. They're like a record of all these unspoken feelings, little memories of people who never knew how much I noticed them. I'll probably never share these lists with anyone, but they feel like my own little love letters, capturing the charm of noticing someone without needing anything in return. So, yeah, that's my weird little habit. I make secret lists about my crushes and keep them as quiet reminders of what I found special in them, even if they never know it. Now that I've confessed, please tell me someone else does something this odd with their crushes. Or am I out here building imaginary files on people all by myself? I'd never seen myself as a big deal job candidate, just another person out there hunting, trying to find something that stuck. But then I found this posting, a role that seemed to scream my name. It was one of those rare combinations of perfect fit and finally, something meaningful. I went all in. I researched the company's history, stalked their social media pages, even watched some obscure interviews with the CEO to get a feel for their core values. I wanted them to see me as someone who didn't just want the job, but understood them, their mission, their goals. It felt personal, like I was preparing for some high-stakes confession. The first interview went well, really well. The recruiter, Mark, was one of those naturally likable guys, effortlessly making small talk while jotting down notes and nodding with enthusiasm. He said things like, "I'm really excited about your experience, and I think the team will love your energy." I walked out thinking, wow, maybe this is it. A few days later, Mark emailed to say they wanted me back for a second round. I should have felt great, but something in his tone was different. Instead of the casual, upbeat tone from the first round, his email sounded oddly formal, almost scripted, like he was just checking boxes. I brushed it off and prepped like crazy for round 2. This time, I'd be speaking with a panel, 3 managers who would be my direct team. I was nervous but ready. I'd practiced responses in the mirror, timed my answers to be both concise and thoughtful, rehearsed anecdotes that showed I'd fit seamlessly into the team. But when the interview started, something felt off. The panel looked tired, as if I was just one more name on a long list they had to get through. One manager barely looked up from her laptop. Another kept glancing at the clock on the wall. And the third, a guy named Alex, looked right at me, but seemed miles away. I tried my best to impress them, talking about projects I'd led, challenges I'd overcome. I thought I was making a good case. But halfway through, Alex interrupted with, "So, what would you say is your biggest professional failure?" It wasn't the question itself. It was how he said it, like he'd asked it 100 times already, and my answer didn't matter. I forced a smile, gave a practiced response, but I could feel the energy drain out of me. By the end of the interview, I didn't even know if they'd heard a word I'd said. As I logged off the call, I told myself it didn't matter. I wanted the job too much to give up over one awkward interview. Then came round 3. Yes, a third round. This time, it was with the company's director of people and culture, an overly polished woman named Valerie, who looked like she'd never had a hair out of place in her life. Valerie had a voice like honey, warm and sweet, but she asked questions that felt like traps. "What would you say are the biggest reasons you want to work here?" she asked, lingering on biggest like there was a right answer. I found myself smiling and answering, but the more I said, the more I felt like I was putting on a performance. And she kept nodding, her eyes never quite matching her expressions, like she'd already decided something. By the time I got off that call, I was mentally drained but still optimistic. After all, They wouldn't drag me through 3 rounds if they weren't interested, right? Then came the big finale, round 4, with none other than the CEO himself. I thought, this is it. I'm in the final stretch. I imagined the CEO would be charismatic, full of energy, with big ideas and the drive to inspire. Instead, he barely looked at me through the video call, even asked at one point, "Wait, what role are you applying for again?" The interview ended after a measly 15 minutes. I sat there staring at the blank screen, feeling like I'd been hit by a train. But I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to a long day on his end. Then, for good measure, I sent a polite thank you email to every person I'd spoken to, including Mark, the recruiter who had been my cheerleader at the start. And I waited. A week passed, then another. I checked my email obsessively, even called once, leaving a voicemail that sounded chipper but slightly desperate. Finally, I sent one last follow-up to Mark, trying to keep it light, even threw in a little "hope to hear from you soon." Nothing. Just silence. I'd been ghosted, plain and simple. After all that build-up, after all those hours of preparation, they decided I wasn't worth the 30 seconds it would have taken to tell me no. I told a friend about it, and she rolled her eyes. "Oh, they just wanted to get a read on the market," she said. "They probably weren't even planning to hire." When I asked what she meant, she explained that some companies interview candidates just to gather information, salary expectations, skill trends, all without ever intending to fill the position. The interview process was just a way to do free research on their competition. It made me sick. All that time, energy, and hope I'd poured into their process, and I'd been nothing more than a piece of data, a tick in some spreadsheet. If I had my way, companies like this would be held accountable. Maybe even fined for every round they put a candidate through without offering a decision. Imagine it. For every week a candidate went without a follow-up, they'd owe a candidate tax. And if they ghosted altogether, they'd lose access to job boards for a month, banned from posting new positions until they cleaned up their act. I'd even take it a step further. What if there was a rating system for companies, like Yelp but for their hiring practices? Candidates could see how many times they'd ghosted people, how many hours they'd wasted, and decide for themselves if they wanted to bother. A few weeks later, that same job posting popped up again, the exact one I'd applied for. It felt like a slap in the face. After everything, they were still out there, hunting for new data points, new people to lead through their process and ghost without a second thought. I was tempted to apply again, to go through the process just to call them out at the end, but I knew better by now. I clicked away, feeling a bitter satisfaction in knowing that I'd moved on, even if they hadn't. Nowadays, I approach interviews like a two-way street. I ask tough questions, no more blind enthusiasm. I don't just sell myself. I make them prove why they deserve my time. If they don't show the respect I'm offering, I walk. It might sound harsh, but after being treated like a disposable name on a list, it's my own quiet rebellion, a way to remind myself that my time is valuable, that I deserve answers. I'm not about to get ghosted again without a fight. Maybe someday, the hiring game will change. Maybe candidates will get the respect we've been demanding, and companies will have to own up to their actions. But until then, I've got my own rules. No more waiting by the inbox. No more wondering if I wasn't enough for a place that couldn't bother to say goodbye. If they can't be decent enough to respond, I'm decent enough to know they're not worth my time. It started out as just another Saturday at my local coffee shop, the kind of day where I planned to hunker down with a book and forget the world existed. But when I walked in, there was nowhere to sit. Every table, every booth, all full. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a voice from behind me. "You can share my table." "I won't bite." I turned around and saw a guy about my age, maybe a little older, with a soft, easygoing smile and a messy stack of papers spread out in front of him. He was wearing one of those old band t-shirts, faded from years of love, and his hair looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. He introduced himself as Theo, and I took the seat opposite him, feeling a bit unsure but intrigued. What started as a polite exchange of pleasantries turned into something else altogether. Theo had this curious way about him. He'd listen intently, his eyes lighting up as I spoke, like he found every word interesting. I was the guarded type, typically wary of strangers, but his sincerity made it easy to let my guard down. Soon, I found myself sharing stories about my family, my job, and even the novel I was secretly working on. When I asked what he was working on, he grinned and said, "It's complicated. I'm trying to figure things out." He didn't elaborate, and for some reason, I didn't press. There was something both mysterious and vulnerable about him. Like he had layers he wasn't ready to peel back yet. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and we were the last two people left in the coffee shop. He walked me out, and we stood outside in the cold night air, just looking at each other. I half expected him to ask for my number, or at least suggest we meet up again, but he simply said, "Thanks for sharing your day with me." He gave me a soft smile, one that stayed with me as I walked home, replaying our conversation over and over. I felt this strange, quiet sense of longing, mixed with a frustration that I hadn't been braver, hadn't asked for a way to see him again. A week later, I was back at the coffee shop, half hoping he'd be there, but trying to play it cool. I ordered my coffee, found a table, and tried to focus on my book. Just when I convinced myself he wasn't coming, I looked up and there he was, standing at the counter, ordering his coffee. He noticed me and walked over with that same gentle smile. "Mind if I join you again?" he asked, as if we hadn't just spent hours together last week. I tried to act casual, nodding, but inside I felt a thrill. Our second encounter was even more comfortable, like the awkwardness of the first meeting had melted away. This time, he told me a little more about himself. He'd just left a high-paying job in finance, feeling like he was losing himself in the grind. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do, so he was taking some time to rediscover his passion, as he put it. I shared more about my writing, and for the first time, I felt safe enough to tell someone about the characters and scenes I'd been living with in my head for years. He listened like he understood, even when I rambled on, and every now and then, he'd ask a question that made me see my own story in a new way. The next few months turned into a ritual. Every Saturday, we'd meet at that coffee shop without ever having to plan it. We'd grab our usual table, chat for hours, and then part ways with a quiet "see you next time." Neither of us ever labeled it, and we never talked about meeting outside of the coffee shop. But slowly, it became clear that this connection wasn't just random. We were in sync in this almost unspoken way, a rhythm that felt natural and timeless. One chilly afternoon, our conversation took a deeper turn. He asked me, "What scares you most about your writing?" It caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. I told him I was terrified of putting myself out there, of failing, of realizing that my dream might never be more than just that, a dream. He listened, and then shared his own fears about the uncertainty he'd thrown himself into. He admitted he didn't know if he'd made the right choice leaving his career, if he'd ever find what he was searching for. In that moment, I felt a wave of closeness to him, like we were both staring out at a vast, unknown ocean, standing side by side on the shore. By now, my friends had started asking questions. "Who is this mystery coffee shop guy? Why haven't you asked him out?" But every time I thought about breaking our unspoken rule, about asking him to meet outside of our usual coffee shop world, I hesitated. There was something so pure, so perfect about what we had, that I was afraid of ruining it. We had created this private bubble, a safe space where we could just be. Then one Saturday, he didn't show up. I waited for hours, telling myself he'd just gotten caught up or decided to take a weekend away. But when he missed the next Saturday too, I felt a pang of something sharper than I'd expected. I told myself it was silly to be so attached, that it had just been a string of coffee shop conversations. But I knew, deep down, it was more than that. I had let myself care for him in a way I hadn't cared for anyone in a long time. After another week passed with no sign of him, I started to let go. I told myself that maybe he'd found what he was looking for, or maybe he'd moved on. I stopped waiting for him, stopped expecting him to appear, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked into that coffee shop, I half expected to see him sitting there, waiting with that soft smile. Then one rainy Saturday, weeks later, I saw him. He was at our table, looking down at his coffee, as if lost in thought. My heart raced as I approached, trying to keep my excitement in check. He looked up and saw me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of the same warmth I'd been missing. He apologized for disappearing, explaining he needed some time alone to figure things out. He looked at me, his gaze serious but soft, and said, I couldn't let this end without saying goodbye. We sat together in silence for a long moment, the sound of the rain outside filling the space between us. I wanted to tell him everything, that I'd missed him, that our Saturdays had become the best part of my week, that I didn't want this to be goodbye. But instead, I just took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, and let the moment speak for itself. We left the coffee shop together, walking side by side in the rain. There was no grand declaration, no promises. Just two people, sharing an umbrella and a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, their story was only just beginning. The first time I saw her, she was running down the street barefoot, her heels in one hand and a small plant pot in the other, like something straight out of a rom-com. I was locking up my cafe for the night, watching as she stumbled to a stop just outside the door, panting and leaning against the wall. It was nearly midnight, the streets were deserted, and here she was gasping for air, with dirt spilling out of a plant pot in her hand. Do you need help?" I asked, trying not to laugh. She glanced up, still catching her breath. Her hair was a tangled mess, strands stuck to her cheeks from what I could only assume was sweat, but she still had this confident, almost defiant glint in her eye. "I might have just made a terrible life choice," she said between breaths. "But no, I'm good. Just need a second." I leaned back, crossing my arms, curious. Terrible life choice involving a houseplant, and I'm guessing a dramatic exit? "Something like that," she replied, laughing. "Let's just say it was one of those nights where you realize you're at the wrong party. And, well, I took a plant hostage on my way out." I couldn't help but laugh. "Hey, if that plant needed rescuing, then you're practically a hero." She smiled, tilting her head, sizing me up. "So, what kind of hero locks up a cafe at midnight?" "One who's way too invested in his own coffee," I replied, glancing behind me at the cozy, dimly lit cafe. "Late-night coffee experiments. I keep this place open as long as I feel like it, mostly so I can try out new stuff." She raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "Experimental coffee?" "Yeah, pushing the boundaries of caffeine science," I said, half joking. "So far, I've just ended up with weird flavors that only a handful of people ever come back for. But I keep going." She looked at me, curious, like she'd found something unexpectedly interesting. "So, is that an invitation?" she asked, holding up her plant pot. "Because I could use a coffee that doesn't taste like regret." I pushed open the door and gestured for her to come in. "Let's see what I can do about that." Inside, the place was quiet, lit by the soft glow of hanging lights and a few candles I'd left burning. She looked around, taking it all in, and I caught her smiling as she noticed the mismatched chairs, the cozy corners cluttered with books, and the chalkboard wall with half-erased notes about espresso roasts and brewing temperatures. "Is this place always this empty?" she asked, setting the plant down on the counter and sliding into a seat. "Not usually. It's a popular spot during the day, but I lock the doors for a couple of hours each night just to work on my latest disasters in peace," I explained, grabbing 2 mugs. "But tonight it seems I have company." She chuckled, watching as I pulled out a few jars of beans from behind the counter. "Well, I'd say I'm lucky to get an after-hours coffee in a place like this." "Jag glansade over, smiling. Lucky? I'd say it's fate. After all, how often do you run into a barefoot plant thief in need of caffeine?" "Touché," she replied, grinning. "By the way, I'm Jess." "Nice to meet you, Jess," I said, offering my hand. "I'm Sam. And don't worry, I won't ask why you took the plant. A little mystery's good for the soul." She smirked, looking a little relieved. "Good? Some things are better left unexplained." I started brewing, choosing a blend I'd been experimenting with, a rich, deep roast with a hint of dark chocolate and an unexpected kick of cardamom. She watched, fascinated, as I carefully poured and mixed, glancing up every now and then to catch her eye. "So, what was it about this party that made you run?" I asked as I handed her a steaming mug. "Aside from the need to save innocent plants, of course." She took a sip, closing her eyes briefly as the flavors hit her. "Wow, okay, that's amazing." She looked at me with genuine surprise. I think I needed this more than I realized. I chuckled. Coffee has a way of fixing things, or at least making them feel fixable. She sighed, running her finger along the edge of her mug. "It was a night full of pretentious people, I guess. Everyone trying to impress everyone else. I felt like I was suffocating in there, like I was supposed to be someone else. I don't know, maybe it's silly, but sometimes you just want to escape. Not silly at all, I replied, nodding. I get it. I've been to those kinds of parties. Sometimes you just need something real, something that doesn't ask anything from you. She looked at me, and for a moment, there was a silence between us that felt oddly charged. It wasn't awkward. It was like we both understood each other in a way that words didn't need to fill. I watched as she took another sip, visibly relaxing, her shoulders softening, her face unwinding from whatever tension she'd brought in with her. "All right," she said, setting her mug down with a smile. "This coffee? It's like therapy in a cup. You should charge more." I laughed. "Maybe I will, but only for you." Emotional tax. She gave me a mock scowl. "That's not fair. You get to be both therapist and barista." "Perks of the job," I shrugged, grinning. "Plus, I get to meet mysterious barefoot women who save plants from soul-sucking parties." She laughed, this time fully and freely, and it was the kind of laugh that felt like it belonged in a place like this, a sound that made the room warmer, cozier. She glanced down at the plant she'd taken, its leaves a little worse for wear from the journey. "Maybe I'm just a little too impulsive for my own good," she said, almost as if confessing something. "Well, life needs a little impulse, right?" I said, leaning back. "If we're too careful, we end up missing all the fun." She looked at me thoughtfully, her expression softening. "Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it's okay to do something crazy now and then like rescue a plant or stay out way too late drinking experimental coffee with a stranger." I raised my mug to that, to crazy impulses then. We clinked our mugs, and the rest of the night melted away in conversation. We talked about our favorite books, random dreams we had when we were kids, and the weirdest foods we'd ever tried. Hours slipped by, unnoticed, and every now and then one of us would stop mid-sentence just to take in the feeling of the moment. The quiet night, the smell of coffee, the comfortable silence that only comes with the best kinds of company. Eventually, when the candles had burned low and the rain had started to patter against the windows, she looked at the clock and sighed. "I should go. I didn't mean to take up your entire night." "Hey," I said, reaching for her empty mug. "I wouldn't have spent it any other way." She smiled, slipping back in her shoes and picking up her rescued plant. As she stood at the door, she turned, looking at me with a mix of gratitude and mischief in her eyes. "Thanks, Sam, for the coffee. For, well, everything. Anytime," I replied, meaning it more than I could explain. She hesitated for a second, then leaned in, planting a quick kiss on my cheek before pulling away, laughing a little at the surprised look on my face. "Good night, hero barista," she said softly, and with a final smile, she disappeared into the night. After she left, I stood there, feeling the lingering warmth of her kiss, the empty echo of her laughter still in the air. I didn't even know her last name, but somehow it didn't matter. What mattered was the unexpected way she'd walked into my life, barefoot and laughing, leaving me with a story I'd probably never forget. I turned off the lights, locked up, and headed home, carrying with me the warmth of that strange, beautiful night and the hope that maybe, someday, she'd wander back through my door. There was a kid in my high school named Eli who was different, not in an obvious way, like the goth kids who walked around with black trench coats and eyeliner, or the skater kids with their chipped boards and scuffed vans. Eli was just quiet, always in his own world. He had this reputation for being intense. Not intense as an overly studious or a loner who sketched creepy things in his notebook. Just intense like he could see through you if he looked hard enough, and everyone felt it. You'd get this weird shiver if you caught him watching you. Then, during sophomore year, Eli started a project. No one knew what it was about at first. Rumor was it had started as some extra credit thing for a psychology class, but he took it way further. One day, he announced he was building something and needed volunteers, subjects, he called them. He set up a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board by the gym, and to everyone's surprise, people actually started signing up. The weird part? Eli didn't tell anyone what they'd be volunteering for. Just said it was an experiment in perception. I don't know what made me sign up. Maybe it was the curiosity, the challenge, the mystery. Or maybe I was just bored. But I scrawled my name on that list and waited for Eli to let me in on whatever strange thing he was planning. 2 days later, he handed me a small black envelope with my name on it. Inside was a note with instructions that were vague at best, like some kind of twisted scavenger hunt. It said to meet him in the old science wing at exactly 9 p.m. on Friday night. No phones, no friends, no questions. By the time Friday night came, I'd built it up in my head to be something huge. I was a nervous wreck. The science wing was practically abandoned. Part of the original building they'd kept around, but didn't use anymore. A couple of broken windows, dust on every surface, this eerie silence that made your footsteps echo. When I got there, Eli was already waiting, holding a flashlight, his face half lit by its dim beam. Without a word, he handed me a blindfold. "Put it on," he said, dead serious. "Seriously? It's part of the experiment." I hesitated, but against my better judgment, tied the blindfold around my eyes. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then Eli's hand closed around my arm, and he led me forward, his steps firm, unyielding. We walked like that, me stumbling and him guiding, until he stopped and let go. "Stand here," he instructed. I felt him move away, leaving me alone in the dark. The silence stretched, tense and disorienting, until finally his voice came, low and steady. "What do you see?" he asked. I stifled a laugh. "I don't see anything." There was a pause, and then he said, "That's not what I meant. Close your eyes and tell me what you see. What comes to mind?" I stood there, feeling like an idiot, but I went along with it. At first, all I saw was darkness, the usual chaotic swirl of colors and shapes you get when you press your eyes shut. But then, I don't know how to explain it. A feeling crept over me like I was somewhere else entirely. I pictured a hallway, dark and narrow, stretching endlessly in both directions. Doors lined the walls, each one slightly open, a sliver of light spilling out from inside. The place was empty, cold, and I could almost hear this low hum, like the sound of a fridge, steady and unsettling. "Describe it," Eli said, his voice closer than I expected. I told him what I saw, or rather, what I felt. The endless hallway, the doors, the strange hum. I couldn't explain why, but as I described it, the details became sharper, like I was actually there, like the hallway was real. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, clearer. It was a voice, low and fragmented, almost like it was calling for help, echoing from somewhere down that endless hall. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Yes," Eli replied, and something about his tone chilled me. I started to feel uneasy, like I'd gone too far, like I was prying into something that shouldn't be touched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I just walked a little further, I'd find something, someone. My body tensed, ready to move down that hallway, even though I was just standing there in a dusty, abandoned wing of the school, blindfolded. "Open one of the doors," Eli instructed softly. I reached out, mentally, I guess, picturing my hand grasping one of the doorknobs. In my mind's eye, I turned it slowly, and the door creaked open. I could feel Eli watching me, his attention like a weight, urging me to keep going. The door opened to reveal nothing, just pitch-black darkness. But as I stared, the darkness seemed to take shape, swirling like smoke until it formed a figure, something almost human. It looked at me, or at least I thought it did, though it had no face, no features. My chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Eli," I whispered, "what is this?" But Eli didn't answer. The whispering grew louder, pressing in around me, and the figure stretched, bending and twisting as if trying to pull itself out of the darkness. I yanked off the blindfold, gasping for air, and found myself back in the science wing, the dim light of Eli's flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. He was standing there, watching me with this strange, satisfied smile. "What was that?" I managed to choke out. "It's different for everyone," he said cryptically, pocketing his flashlight. "But it's always there, just beneath the surface." I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen, whatever I'd imagined, was more real than I wanted to admit. I didn't go back to the science wing after that night, and I avoided Eli as best as I could. But the hallway, the endless hallway with its whispering doors, stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, waiting, like a place I could return to at any moment if I just let myself slip. A few weeks later, Eli vanished. No warning, no explanation. He didn't show up to school, his locker was empty, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. His number was disconnected, and when I went to his house, his mom just shook her head, her eyes tired, like she'd been asked too many times already. After he left, rumors spread that he'd been sent away, maybe to some special school for kids like him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just left, that somehow he'd stepped through one of those doors in that hallway and didn't find his way back. A few months later, I found a small, black envelope tucked into my locker. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words, written in Eli's handwriting: "Find the hallway." I stared at that note, my heart pounding, half tempted to crumple it up and pretend I never saw it. But every now and then, late at night, when sleep doesn't come easily, I still feel like I'm standing in that endless hallway, hearing that low hum, the whispers, and the faint feeling of someone or something waiting for me behind those doors. I pulled into the parking lot of the strip mall, not even sure why I was here. The rain had been falling in a steady drizzle, coating everything in a dull gray sheen, and the Sunny Acres self-storage sign flickered, half the letters burnt out. It was not the kind of place I'd pictured for an emotional reunion, but my mother's email had been brief and strangely businesslike. "I need you to come. We're cleaning out Unit 314. It's time." I hadn't seen or spoken to her in almost 3 years. A lot of that was my choice. She'd never really been one to keep in touch, and the little we did talk had always been strained, weighed down by the past. And yet, here I was, standing in a puddle in front of a storage unit, feeling more like a stranger than her daughter. When she appeared around the corner, she looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a raincoat with her short hair hidden under a frayed baseball cap. For a moment, I thought about turning around, heading back to my car, and just calling it a day. But she saw me before I could move. "Glad you came," she said, her voice carrying an almost neutral tone, like we'd seen each other last week, like nothing about this was strange. She held out a key, and I took it, the cold metal pressing into my palm like a quiet challenge. "It's mostly old stuff," she added with a shrug, "but you should look through it." I didn't know what I expected to find in there. Maybe just some dusty cardboard boxes, forgotten furniture, and a few random knickknacks. But as I rolled up the door, the contents of Unit 314 took me by surprise. It wasn't cluttered, but arranged with a strange care, almost like a gallery of our family's past. Old chairs covered in sheets, plastic bins with faded labels, and at the center, a single wooden trunk, the kind you'd imagine finding in an attic of an old Victorian house. I reached out and touched it, brushing away a fine layer of dust. "What's all this, Mom?" She walked over and knelt beside the trunk, her hand resting on the lid. I guess this is everything we left behind." I looked at her, trying to understand, but she just nodded toward the trunk, her eyes distant. "Go ahead, open it." Inside, there were old photos, faded and curled at the edges, a few letters and envelopes that had yellowed over time, and, unexpectedly, several small toys I hadn't seen since I was a child. I picked up a worn-out stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, feeling a jolt of recognition that made my chest tighten. "I thought we lost this," I murmured, holding it up. "You did," she said quietly. "You lost a lot of things when we left. I kept them." Her voice cracked a little, though she quickly regained her composure, busying herself with sorting through the other items. I could see her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, like she was measuring my reaction to everything I touched. I wanted to ask why she had kept all this, why she hadn't just thrown it away, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. So I sifted through the trunk in silence, unearthing old holiday decorations, a school project I'd done in the 4th grade, and even a crumpled paper crown from one of my childhood birthday parties. Eventually, I found an old Polaroid album near the bottom, each photo encased in plastic. As I flipped through, I saw pieces of a life I'd half forgotten. My parents and me in the kitchen of our old house, the one we'd left when I was 10. The 3 of us at some beach, squinting against the sun. My dad, sitting at the piano, his his hands hovering above the keys, caught mid-song. "He loved that piano," I said softly, my fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "He did," she replied, her voice barely audible. "He always said it was the one place he could lose himself, like the music held something he couldn't say out loud." I looked at her, surprised by the rare openness in her expression. My father had left when I was 12, and I'd spent years resenting both of them, first for the abandonment, and then for my mother's silence. She never spoke about him, never offered explanations, and I'd been too afraid to ask. After a while, she motioned to a small cardboard box near the back of the unit. "There's more in there," she said, almost hesitant. "Stuff I never showed you." The box was heavier than it looked. I set it down and opened it carefully, and inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with a thin, fraying ribbon. They were all in my father's handwriting, each addressed to me, though none of them had ever been sent. What are these?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. She swallowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He wrote them after he left. He thought maybe someday you want to know him. He gave them to me when I saw him for the last time, told me to keep them until you were ready." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, her face shadowed with something I couldn't quite name. I picked up the top letter and read the first line, the words blurring a bit as I tried to process them. "Dear Lila, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stay." I stopped reading, feeling a strange mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't name. Why had he never sent these? Why had he just left, only to try to explain himself in words he never intended me to read? My mother placed a hand on my shoulder. "I thought about giving them to you 100 times, she said quietly. "But every time, I thought maybe it was better for you not to have them. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But now," she sighed, looking down at her hands. "I'm tired, Lila. Tired of keeping it all in." We spent the rest of the day in silence, sorting through the last of the boxes, each item a piece of a story that had been left untold for too long. I could feel a shift between us, like the weight of years was slowly lifting, though neither of us quite knew what to do with it. When we finished, I closed the trunk and sat on it, feeling its solid weight beneath me like an anchor. "What are we supposed to do with all this?" I asked, half joking, half serious. She gave me a small, sad smile. "I think maybe we let it go. Let it be what it was and try to find something new." I nodded, the words settling in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe that was possible. Maybe we could start over, not with clean slates, but with the pieces we'd carefully chosen to keep. As I stood to leave, I picked up the box of letters and tucked it under my arm, feeling their weight against me, both heavy and oddly comforting. "Take care of them," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "They're yours now." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and she reached out, brushing my arm softly, like she was afraid I'd disappear. We walked to our cars together, and as I watched her drive away, the rain beginning to fall again in soft sheets, I knew that something between us had shifted. We were both still carrying pieces of the past, but now, for the first time, we weren't carrying them alone.